This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. Part 1. The first lie of the evening appeared on the screen before anyone had even finished their champagne. It floated there in soft gold lettering over a slideshow of smiling photographs. My parents at the center of every frame, glowing with the kind of pride that only comes from a carefully rehearsed version of reality. Retirement celebration for Martin and Elaine Fletcher. 40 years of dedication, sacrifice, and family. The word family lingered on the wall like a joke that only I understood. I stood near the back of the garden room at the Bristol Harbor Hotel, hands folded behind my back, the way years of discipline had trained me to stand in crowded spaces. Old instincts from the cockpit translated easily to rooms like this. Observe first, speak later, calculate the atmosphere before touching anything fragile. The room smelled faintly of citrus polish and expensive wine. Outside the tall windows, the lights along the harbor shimmered across the dark water, calm and distant. Inside, my parents' world was performing. Neighbors from Clifton mingled beside colleagues from the financial advisory firm where my father had spent his career. Former church friends, a handful of people who clearly came only because retirement parties in Bristol were the sort of thing where appearances mattered. And then there was me. I had almost not come. For most of my adult life, distance had been my quiet solution. Long-haul flights, training rotations, hotels in cities where nobody knew my name except the person checking my passport at the crew desk. Distance made family history easier to ignore. But my mother had called 3 weeks earlier with a voice sweet enough to make strangers think she was incapable of cruelty. She said the family should be together for something this important. She said it would mean a lot. She said everyone would be there. What she did not say, what she never said, was that in the Fletcher household, togetherness always had a price. The slideshow shifted to another photo. My brother Daniel at age 10 holding a cricket trophy that had belonged to the school team. My father's arm wrapped proudly around his shoulders. The caption read, "Our star." A few people in the room laughed softly, charmed by the memory. Daniel stood near the front table, now, older but wearing the same expression I remembered from childhood, an effortless confidence that came from always knowing the story would bend in his favor. The favored child. The investment, the one my parents had built their narrative around. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the old reflex of irritation trying to rise before I pushed it down. 35 years of living had taught me something simple. Arguments never changed stories that people were committed to believing. Facts did, and facts required patience. Across the room, waiters began carrying trays of starters between clusters of guests. Laughter filled the air, warm and effortless. For everyone else here, this was a pleasant retirement evening. For my parents, it was something else. A final performance. The chance to cement the version of history they had been polishing for decades. I recognized the rhythm immediately because I had grown up inside it. Step 1, tell the story often enough that people stop questioning it. Step 2, reward the child who plays along. Step 3, quietly erase the one who remembers differently. I had been erased before. That was why I had spent most of my 30s building a life that required no approval from anyone in this room. Flying commercial aircraft gave you a certain perspective on distance. When you spent your mornings 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, the arguments people held onto at ground level looked very small. Still, some things followed you, no matter how far you flew. A burst of laughter rose near the front of the room. My mother had stepped beside the projector, a champagne flute in one hand and the small remote for the slideshow in the other. She wore a navy dress that matched the color of the harbor outside the windows. To strangers, she looked like every polished professional mother Bristol had ever admired. Warm smile, elegant posture, perfectly controlled voice. She began greeting guests one by one, weaving through the crowd with practiced grace. Every introduction came with a version of the same sentence. "This is my husband Martin. He built everything we have." Or, "This is Daniel, our brilliant son." I watched the pattern repeat as if someone were playing a familiar recording. Then her eyes found me. Just for a second. A pause too small for anyone else to notice. Her smile sharpened. She guided two elegantly dressed neighbors toward the back of the room where I stood. The man wore the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to expensive boardrooms. The woman beside him carried herself with that careful attentiveness of someone evaluating social hierarchies in real time. My mother placed a gentle hand on the woman's arm. Her voice carried easily through the soft hum of conversation. "And that is Jonah," she said lightly. "He helps us around the house these days." A small, polite laugh. "He's practically the maid." The words landed softly, so softly that most people in the room barely noticed. But something strange happened at that exact moment. The man standing beside her stopped smiling. He turned his head slowly, and when his eyes met mine, recognition flickered across his face in a way my parents had not anticipated. Across the room, the slideshow clicked forward to the next photograph. But the story in the room had already started changing, and my parents had no idea yet that the most dangerous guest at their retirement party had just realized who I was. Part 2. Recognition is a strange thing. It moves quietly at first, like a shift in cabin pressure that only the pilot notices before anyone else feels it. The man beside my mother did not react immediately. That was the first sign he was used to controlling situations. His expression remained polite, the same calm smile he had worn while she introduced my father and Daniel. But his eyes stayed on me, and they narrowed very slightly. I had seen that look before in conference rooms and briefing lounges, when someone realized a person standing in front of them was not who the room assumed they were. It was the moment when two different stories collided. My mother, of course, noticed none of this. She was still smiling with the effortless brightness she had practiced for decades. "This is Jonah," she repeated casually, gesturing toward me with the careless familiarity of someone pointing out a decorative object in their home. "He helps us around the house these days. Such a blessing, really." Martin and I are getting older. A few nearby guests chuckled politely. Someone made a remark about how difficult it was to find reliable help these days. I kept my posture relaxed. 35 years of practice had made moments like this almost predictable. When you grew up inside a family system built on quiet humiliation, you learned to recognize the cues long before the scene fully formed. The trick was never reacting too quickly, because reacting meant playing your assigned role. The man beside my mother finally spoke. His voice was calm, curious rather than confrontational. "Jonah Fletcher?" My mother's smile widened. "Yes," she said brightly. "Our eldest? Well, technically, he's always been independent." The pause before that last word was deliberate. I could almost see the invisible punctuation marks she had been using my entire life. Independent meant difficult. Difficult meant ungrateful. Ungrateful meant the family's version of events did not apply to me. It was an efficient little linguistic system. The man nodded slowly. I could see the moment he confirmed something in his mind. Then he stepped toward me. Up close, he looked slightly older than I had remembered from the corporate website photo. Early 50s, perhaps, silver just beginning to edge through his dark hair. But the eyes were unmistakable. Sharp, observant, used to evaluating people in seconds. Oliver Grant, CEO of the aviation consulting firm that had just hired me 2 weeks earlier. The same company whose training division was expanding across Europe. The same company whose Bristol office I would soon be helping manage. My mother watched the interaction with mild curiosity, as if she expected a polite nod before everyone returned to their wine. Instead, Oliver Grant extended his hand. "Jonah," he said. The way he said my name was careful, measured, the tone of someone confirming a detail before making a larger decision. For a second, the noise of the room faded slightly. The hum of conversation blurred into a distant murmur the way cabin sound does when the cockpit door closes. I shook his hand. "Good evening." My mother blinked. She had expected silence from me. Silence was the role I had always played best in these situations. Oliver Grant tilted his head slightly, studying my face. Then something almost like amusement touched the corner of his mouth. He turned to my mother. "Elaine, I believe there may be a misunderstanding." Her smile froze, just a fraction. "Oh?" Oliver glanced briefly around the room before lowering his voice in a way that somehow made nearby guests lean closer without realizing it. "Jonah Fletcher is not your maid." The words landed gently, too gently to sound like an accusation. But the temperature of the conversation shifted instantly. My mother laughed. The bright, dismissive laugh she used whenever someone wandered too close to a truth she preferred to avoid. "Oh goodness, of course not," she said quickly. "Just a little joke. You know how family humor can be." But Oliver did not laugh with her. Instead, he looked back at me again. And in that moment, I realized something important. He had not been invited to this party by accident. Somewhere in the chain of my parents' social connections, neighbors, business acquaintances, charity boards, his name had entered the guest list without anyone realizing who he was to me, which meant something very unusual had just happened. Two separate versions of my life had collided in the same room. My parents' story and the real one. Oliver turned back toward my mother, his voice still polite. "I see." He took a sip from the glass a waiter had just handed him. Then he added something that sounded almost casual. "Jonah actually starts with our firm next month." For a moment, my mother did not react at all. The sentence simply hovered there between us. One or two nearby guests shifted their weight slightly. My father, across the room near the dessert table, glanced in our direction with mild curiosity. My brother Daniel was still laughing with a group of friends, unaware that the structure of the evening had just begun to change. My mother's smile returned, but this time it looked tighter. "Our firm?" she asked lightly. Oliver nodded. "Grant Aviation Consulting." The name traveled through the air like a quiet electrical current. Even people who did not follow aviation closely had heard of it. The firm advised airlines, airports, and regulatory agencies across Europe. My mother blinked once, then twice, but her voice remained perfectly composed. "Oh, how interesting." She turned to me with the same careful warmth she used whenever strangers were watching. "Jonah has always been good with planes." A few guests chuckled. The line was meant to shrink the moment, reduce something professional into a childhood hobby. But Oliver Grant was still looking at me, and the expression in his eyes had shifted again. Because in that instant, he understood something my parents did not. This evening had been planned as a performance, but the wrong audience member had just stepped onto the stage, and the real story was about to start asking questions. Part 3. If there is one thing aviation teaches you, it is that tension rarely announces itself loudly. It builds slowly, almost politely, like a shift in wind direction that only matters once you are already in the air. The room at the Bristol Harbor Hotel was still full of warm conversation, the soft clinking of glasses, the quiet hum of music drifting through hidden speakers in the ceiling. Nothing dramatic had happened. No raised voices, no sudden arguments. And yet, the atmosphere had changed. People sensed it without knowing why. Oliver Grant was still standing beside my mother, his posture relaxed, one hand loosely holding a wine glass. Anyone passing by would see nothing unusual, but his eyes had not left my face. My mother, meanwhile, had recovered her smile. She had spent 4 decades mastering social recovery, smoothing over awkward moments before anyone could examine them too closely. She touched Oliver's arm with practiced charm. "Well, that's wonderful news for Jonah," she said lightly. "Our son has always had big dreams." Big dreams. It was an interesting phrase. In my parents' language, it usually meant unrealistic ambitions. The kind that required family support they claimed I had already wasted. Across the room, my father had begun moving toward us. He walked with the steady confidence of someone who believed every room eventually revolved around him. Daniel followed a few steps behind, curiosity on his face. My father greeted Oliver with the firm handshake of a man accustomed to financial meetings and retirement speeches. "Martin Fletcher," he said warmly. "I don't believe we've met." Oliver returned the handshake. "Oliver Grant." My father's expression flickered. Even people outside the aviation industry occasionally recognize that name. "Ah, of course," he said after a brief pause. "The consulting firm." Oliver nodded politely. "The very same." My father glanced briefly at me, just long enough to remind me of the hierarchy that had defined our household for most of my life. Then he looked back at Oliver with the same smooth confidence he used when explaining financial strategies to wealthy clients. "And how do you know our Jonah?" "Our Jonah." The phrasing made it sound as though I were a distant cousin rather than a son who had grown up under his roof. Oliver tilted his head slightly. "We met during a training evaluation in London earlier this month." His voice carried easily through the small circle that had formed around us. Several nearby guests had drifted closer, drawn by the subtle shift in conversation. "Jonah has been selected to assist with our European expansion program." The sentence landed quietly, but this time it did not disappear into polite laughter. My father's smile hesitated. "Expansion program?" he asked. Oliver nodded. "We're opening a new operations division focused on pilot training and regulatory coordination across several major airports, Bristol included." A faint murmur rippled through the small group of listeners. People in Bristol paid attention when large companies mentioned expansion. My brother Daniel finally stepped forward. Daniel Fletcher had always been good at entering conversations just as they reached interesting points. It was a skill my parents had rewarded often. He placed an easy hand on my shoulder the way older brothers sometimes do when they want to appear supportive while quietly reminding everyone who holds the social advantage. "That sounds impressive," he said to Oliver, though Jonah has always liked exaggerating his career a bit. The words were delivered with a casual laugh, a joke, just family humor. Several guests smiled politely. Daniel continued smoothly. "He flies commercial routes, of course, but managing expansions? That's quite a leap." The old script was unfolding again. Step 1, introduce doubt. Step 2, encourage the room to laugh along. Step 3, restore the familiar hierarchy. For a moment, nobody spoke. Oliver Grant studied Daniel with mild interest, as though observing a business negotiation that had taken an unexpected turn. Then he set his wine glass down on the nearby table. His voice remained perfectly calm. Actually, the position was offered after a fairly competitive selection process. The words carried no arrogance, just quiet clarity. Jonah's operational experience and training record were difficult to ignore. Another small pause settled over the group. My mother laughed again a little too quickly. "Well, that's lovely," she said, though Jonah has always been the adventurous one. Daniel took the sensible path. She gestured proudly toward my brother. "Finance, just like his father." Daniel smiled modestly. Oliver nodded politely. A strong profession. But his gaze returned to me. Curious. Evaluating. It was the same look I had seen across conference tables, when executives realized the person sitting quietly in the corner might actually control the most important information in the room. One of the neighbors, a woman in an emerald dress, leaned forward slightly. "So Jonah will be working here in Bristol then?" Oliver answered before I could. "Eventually, yes." He glanced briefly toward the harbor windows where the city lights shimmered against the water. The expansion team will oversee several infrastructure partnerships, airports, training facilities, regulatory planning. His tone remained casual, but the list of responsibilities hung in the air like a slowly assembling puzzle. My father cleared his throat. "That sounds like quite a responsibility for a pilot." Oliver's smile returned. "Jonah isn't just a pilot." Another pause. This one longer, more deliberate. Across the room, the slideshow shifted again. Another photograph appeared on the screen. my parents standing proudly in front of the family home in Clifton. The caption read, "Our greatest achievement." Several guests turned briefly to admire the picture, but Oliver Grant was still watching me, and something in his expression suggested he had just realized something else, something my parents definitely did not want discussed in this room. Because while they had spent years crafting a story about sacrifice, success, and family unity, they had overlooked one very inconvenient detail. I knew exactly how that house in the photograph had been paid for, and if the evening kept moving in the direction it had just started, so would everyone else. Part 4. The photograph on the screen lingered longer than the others. Our house in Clifton stood in perfect evening light, the limestone facade glowing softly under the golden tint of the slideshow filter. My parents stood in the driveway with the relaxed confidence of people who believed they had built something impressive. The caption beneath the photo read, "Our greatest achievement." A few guests nodded approvingly. The Clifton property market had always been a quiet measure of success in Bristol. Owning a large home there suggested stability, discipline, and a certain level of financial intelligence, exactly the image my father had spent decades cultivating. My mother followed the direction of everyone's gaze and smiled proudly. "That house has been our sanctuary for years," she said warmly. "Martin worked tirelessly to provide it for our family." The sentence landed with the familiar rhythm of a rehearsed story. Several guests murmured politely. One man even complimented the garden landscaping visible in the photograph. My father inclined his head modestly. "Hard work and careful planning," he said. I watched Oliver Grant out of the corner of my eye. He was still looking at the screen, but not the way the others were. Where most guests saw a family photo, Oliver seemed to be processing something else entirely. Context, numbers, details. His kind of mind probably did that automatically, the way pilots instinctively monitor weather patterns while everyone else simply enjoys the view. Daniel stepped closer to the projector table and picked up a glass of champagne. "We practically grew up renovating that place," he said with a casual laugh. "Dad always had some project going." My mother nodded enthusiastically. "Oh yes, Jonah especially loved helping with the house when he was younger." She turned slightly toward the nearest group of guests, though of course he preferred traveling eventually. Always restless, that one. The line drew soft laughter again. Restless. It was a kinder synonym than difficult. I let the words pass without reaction. Years ago, I might have corrected the story. Now I simply observed it. Oliver finally looked away from the screen. "You've owned the property a long time then?" he asked. My father answered immediately. "Nearly 20 years," he sounded proud. "Clifton Real Estate has treated us well." A neighbor nodded in agreement. "Properties there have nearly tripled in value since the early 2000s. My father smiled modestly again. Timing and discipline. Simple principles. The conversation could have ended there. Another pleasant moment in a retirement celebration. But Oliver Grant had the quiet persistence of someone used to analyzing business structures, and something in my father's statement had clearly caught his attention. 20 years, Oliver repeated thoughtfully. Interesting. My father raised an eyebrow. In what sense? Oliver glanced toward me briefly, then back to my father. Because if I recall correctly, the property transfer listed in the Clifton District Registry happened about 9 years ago. The air shifted. Not dramatically, just enough for the closest listeners to stop sipping their drinks. My father's smile remained in place. Registry details can be confusing sometimes. Oliver nodded easily. Of course. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed his phone. It was such a casual motion that no one initially paid attention until he continued speaking. My firm does quite a bit of property analysis when evaluating regional infrastructure investments. His fingers moved across the screen. Airports tend to attract surrounding development, so occasionally we examine nearby ownership records. My mother's posture stiffened slightly. Guests nearby were listening now with subtle curiosity. Oliver turned the phone slightly toward me, just enough for me to see the document displayed. The title transfer summary: Clifton District Land Registry. Property owner, Jonah Fletcher. Registered 9 years prior. My mother's champagne glass paused halfway to her lips. My father blinked once. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it stretched long enough for several nearby guests to notice the sudden absence of conversation. Oliver slipped the phone back into his pocket. Of course, he said lightly, records don't always tell the full story. My father laughed, a fraction too loudly. Yes, well, property arrangements within families can be complicated. Daniel nodded quickly. Exactly. Just paperwork, logistics. But Oliver wasn't looking at them. His gaze had returned to me, calm, patient, curious. The same look a seasoned executive might give a colleague during a negotiation when a new piece of information suddenly changed the balance of the room. One of the neighbors, a retired solicitor named Margaret, who had lived on my parents' street for years, leaned forward slightly. I didn't realize the house was under Jonah's name. The sentence was simple, but questions often begin that way. My mother smiled again, though the expression had lost some of its earlier ease. Temporary arrangements, she said quickly. Families help each other. My father nodded. Exactly. Daniel added another laugh. Jonah's always been the adventurous one. He enjoys unusual arrangements. The conversation hovered there awkwardly. Guests glanced between us. Some pretended to focus on the slideshow again, but the moment had already begun expanding. Oliver Grant folded his arms lightly. He looked thoughtful now, as if he had just stumbled upon a detail that didn't quite fit the narrative he had been hearing all evening. Then he asked the quiet question that shifted everything 1 inch closer to the truth. So Jonah has been supporting the property for nearly a decade? The words were neutral, but the implications were not. And for the first time that evening, my parents looked at me with something that was not rehearsed. Uncertainty. Part 5. Uncertainty is a fragile thing. Once it appears in a room built on confidence, it spreads faster than anyone expects. My parents had spent decades perfecting the tone of quiet authority that came with being the hosts of their own narrative. In their version of events, every detail was simple, every explanation already prepared. But uncertainty had just slipped through a crack they hadn't noticed. Margaret, the retired solicitor, still stood near the projector table with her head slightly tilted. People who spent their careers studying documents developed a certain instinct for inconsistencies. You could see it in the way she studied faces when someone mentioned property records. Jonah supporting the property, she repeated thoughtfully. My mother set her champagne glass down. Her smile returned again, but this time it looked like something assembled rather than natural. Oh goodness, she said lightly, nothing quite that dramatic. Jonah has always been very helpful with administrative matters. Martin and I never enjoyed paperwork. The explanation floated into the room like a delicate balloon. My father nodded with practiced ease. Exactly. Registry arrangements, signatures, legal technicalities. You know how these things can become unnecessarily complicated. Margaret gave a polite smile. Yes, sometimes they can. But her eyes had not left my face. The slideshow behind us clicked to the next photograph. This one showed Daniel in graduation robes, my parents standing proudly on either side of him. The caption read, "Our brilliant son." A few guests applauded gently. Daniel raised his glass in acknowledgement, smiling the easy smile of someone who had always thrived in these moments. But the small circle around us remained unusually quiet. Oliver Grant broke the silence. "Jonah," he said calmly. His tone was friendly, almost conversational. "You've owned the Clifton property since you were 26? My mother turned toward him quickly. "Oh, it's not quite like that." Her voice was still cheerful, but the pace had changed slightly. Jonah was traveling extensively back then. He barely spent time at home, which was technically true. I had spent most of my 20s building flight hours across Europe, but truth inside a larger story can still be misleading. Oliver nodded politely. "Of course." Then he added another small detail. Property maintenance must have been complicated while flying internationally. My father answered before anyone else could. Jonah has always enjoyed handling responsibilities. The phrasing was interesting. Enjoyed, as though managing mortgage payments and property taxes had been a hobby rather than a financial reality. Daniel chuckled. Our brother loves projects. Several nearby guests smiled faintly, but Margaret was still thinking. Forgive me, she said after a moment. Old professional curiosity. Her voice was gentle but precise. If Jonah held the title 9 years ago, that would have been shortly after the financial restructuring period many families went through around that time. The word restructuring carried weight in a city like Bristol. People remembered the banking tremors that had passed quietly through respectable neighborhoods in those years. My father cleared his throat. Many families adjusted their finances back then. Margaret nodded. Yes. Her gaze moved slowly between my parents, Daniel, and finally me, usually through refinancing or ownership transfers to protect assets. The sentence hung delicately in the air. Oliver Grant leaned slightly against the table, listening with quiet interest. My mother laughed again. You make it sound terribly serious. Margaret's expression softened. Property law often is. Then she asked the question that had been forming in several minds at once. Jonah, were you the one who secured the mortgage when the house changed ownership? The room became very still. Across the hall, waiters began setting dessert plates along the long table near the windows. The quiet clink of porcelain sounded strangely loud. My parents both looked at me. The look was subtle but unmistakable. The silent instruction of an old family rule. Say something harmless. Deflect. Restore the story. I felt Oliver's attention beside me. Not intrusive, simply patient. Years of flying had taught me that silence can sometimes be more powerful than explanation. When the cockpit falls quiet before turbulence, experienced pilots don't rush to fill the space with unnecessary words. They wait for the instruments to finish telling the truth. Margaret was still waiting. Several guests nearby pretended not to listen, but every ear in the circle was focused now. I finally spoke. Yes, the word was simple, calm, unhurried. I secured the mortgage. Margaret blinked once. Yourself? I nodded. My flight contracts at the time made it possible. Oliver Grant's eyebrows lifted slightly. Impressive at that age. Daniel shifted his weight. Jonah always had unusual luck with money, he said quickly. My mother nodded. Yes, circumstances aligned very conveniently. Circumstances. Another elegant word for something they had never quite explained to anyone. Margaret looked thoughtful. And the property remained under your name since then? My father opened his mouth, but Oliver spoke first. That would match the registry listing. The statement was neutral, factual. But facts have a quiet gravity. They pull attention toward them whether people intend to follow or not. A neighbor from 2 houses down leaned closer. Wait, he said. Does that mean Jonah technically owns the house? My mother laughed again, but this time the sound was thin. Family homes are never about technicalities. Daniel nodded firmly. Exactly. We all live there together. But Oliver Grant was still studying me, and something in his expression had shifted again. Because executives who manage large operations recognize certain patterns quickly. Control of property, control of documentation, control of financial leverage. 3 quiet facts that can rearrange a conversation faster than emotion ever could. Across the room, the dessert trays began moving toward the guests. Chocolate tarts, lemon custard, small silver forks. A pleasant ending to a retirement celebration. But Oliver Grant asked one more question before the plates reached our table. A question delivered with the same mild curiosity he had used all evening. Jonah, he said, do you still hold the mortgage records? The silence that followed felt heavier than any raised voice, because everyone in that small circle suddenly realized something. If the answer was yes, then the person my parents had introduced as the maid was holding the only paperwork in the room that actually mattered. Part 6. The silence stretched long enough for the waiter beside us to hesitate. He stood with a silver tray of chocolate tarts, unsure whether to interrupt the strange pause that had settled over the group. Eventually, he placed the desserts carefully on the table and moved on, sensing, like most service professionals do, when a conversation had turned into something more delicate than polite small talk. Oliver Grant's question still hung in the air. "Do you still hold the mortgage records?" It had been asked casually, but casual questions often reveal the most. My parents both looked at me again. This time the expression was different. Earlier there had been uncertainty. Now there was calculation. My mother spoke first. "Oh, Jonah has always been wonderfully organized," she said brightly, her voice lifting slightly the way it did whenever she wanted to guide a conversation away from dangerous specifics. "I'm sure everything is somewhere in his filing cabinets." Her tone made it sound charming, harmless, as if paperwork were merely a personality quirk. But Oliver had not asked about filing cabinets. He had asked about records. Margaret, the solicitor, folded her hands thoughtfully. "Mortgage records usually remain with the primary signer," she said gently. My father laughed. "Yes, of course, but families share responsibilities. Nothing unusual about that." Daniel took a small bite of his dessert and nodded. "Exactly. Dad has always handled the finances." The line sounded automatic, a reflex built over years of repetition. But Oliver Grant's gaze was still on me, and he had the quiet patience of someone who understood that the most accurate answers rarely come from the loudest voices in the room. I could feel the weight of attention gathering. More guests had drifted closer, drawn by the subtle tension, the way people instinctively gather near an unfolding story. Across the hall, the slideshow continued its gentle rotation through family photographs, childhood holidays, garden barbecues, Christmas mornings, each image carefully selected to reinforce the same narrative. The Fletcher family, successful, supportive, united. But the conversation near the dessert table had begun peeling at the edges of that picture. Margaret cleared her throat softly. "Jonah?" Her voice was kind, professional curiosity rather than accusation. "Do you still hold the mortgage records?" The second time she asked, the room seemed even quieter. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. The motion was slow, deliberate. My mother's smile flickered, just briefly, because she recognized something in that movement. Preparation. I removed my phone and unlocked the screen. Not dramatically, simply the way someone might check a message. But instead of a message, the document folder appeared. Years of scanned paperwork, title transfers, mortgage agreements, payment histories, 9 years of quiet administration. Oliver Grant watched with clear interest now. Daniel shifted slightly beside me. "Jonah," he said lightly, "there's no need to get into boring paperwork tonight. This is supposed to be a celebration." Several guests nodded politely, but Margaret leaned forward. "Property law is rarely boring to me." A small ripple of laughter passed through the group. I turned the phone screen toward them. The document opened easily. Clifton District Property Registry. Title holder, Jonah Fletcher. Mortgage agreement. Primary signatory, Jonah Fletcher. Payment history. Active. Margaret adjusted her glasses slightly. "Goodness." My father's voice arrived quickly. "Those are simply legal structures we arranged for convenience." The explanation sounded confident, but his eyes had shifted toward the screen. Oliver asked quietly, "Convenience for whom?" My mother laughed again. "Oliver, you're making it sound far more serious than it is." She reached for her champagne glass again. "Jonah travels constantly. It simply made sense for him to manage certain documents." Margaret tilted her head. "Most travelers don't personally carry a mortgage for a property they rarely live in." The sentence was spoken without judgment, just observation. Daniel placed his dessert fork down. "Jonah enjoys helping the family," he said. That old line again, helping. But Oliver Grant had noticed something else entirely. He pointed gently toward the payment history on the screen. "These transactions appear monthly." My father's voice tightened slightly. "Of course." Oliver looked at me. "Your payments?" The room held its breath. because everyone present understood what the answer might mean. Not emotionally, financially. I nodded. Margaret looked back at my parents. "Martin," she said gently, "does that mean Jonah has been carrying the mortgage for the Clifton property for 9 years?" My father opened his mouth, closed it again. For the first time all evening, he did not immediately produce a polished explanation. Daniel tried to fill the gap. Jonah's flight contracts paid well. It was easier that way. But Margaret's mind was already following the implications. "That would also mean," she said slowly, "that if Jonah chose to." Her sentence trailed off. Everyone in the circle understood the rest without hearing it spoken. Ownership gives options, legal ones. Oliver Grant's voice returned softly. "Interesting family arrangement." He didn't sound critical, just fascinated. My mother forced another smile. "Families trust each other." Oliver nodded thoughtfully. "Yes." But then he added something that shifted the ground beneath the conversation. "Trust usually moves both directions." The words were quiet, but they carried weight. Across the room, another photograph appeared on the slideshow screen. This one showed my parents standing proudly in the garden beside the house. The caption beneath it read, "Built on sacrifice." Several guests turned to admire the image, but those standing near the dessert table were no longer looking at the screen. They were looking at me, because the quiet truth had just begun spreading through the room. The house everyone admired, the house my parents had just introduced to their wealthy neighbors as the reward for a lifetime of sacrifice, was technically owned by the same person they'd introduced 15 minutes earlier as the Maid. And suddenly the story my parents had spent years telling no longer sounded quite as convincing. Oliver Grant lifted his wine glass thoughtfully. Then he asked the question that would push the evening past the point of polite recovery. "Jonah," he said, "does your family still believe that house belongs to them?" Part 7. There are moments when a room changes shape, not physically, of course. The same chairs remain where they were, the same glasses sit on the same white tablecloths. The harbor lights still shimmer through the tall windows exactly as they did before, but something invisible shifts. Authority. Assumptions. The invisible hierarchy that tells everyone who holds power and who politely stays quiet. Oliver Grant's question had done exactly that. Does your family still believe that house belongs to them? He had not raised his voice. He had not even sounded confrontational. But the phrasing cut directly through the polite fog that had surrounded the conversation all evening. Several guests nearby stopped pretending they were not listening. Margaret, the solicitor, adjusted her glasses again, watching carefully now. My mother did something subtle. She laughed. But this time the sound didn't travel very far. "Oh, Oliver," she said lightly, "you're turning a simple family arrangement into a legal debate." The line was delivered smoothly. Years of social experience had taught her how to dissolve uncomfortable questions with charm. But Oliver Grant had spent his career in negotiations where charm often hid the most important details. He smiled politely. Sometimes simple arrangements become interesting when the paperwork is examined. My father cleared his throat. "The mortgage situation was temporary," he said firmly. "Jonah agreed to help during a difficult period." Temporary. The word arrived quickly. Daniel nodded beside him. "Exactly. Dad was restructuring some investments at the time." Margaret looked thoughtful. 9 years is quite a long restructuring period. Daniel shrugged. Markets can be unpredictable. Several guests exchanged glances. Bristol had its share of quiet financial stories. People knew that investments sometimes collapsed behind polite neighborhood facades. Still, 9 years was difficult to describe as temporary. Oliver looked back at me. "And you continued making the payments?" His voice remained calm. "Yes." My answer was simple. No drama. Just the truth. Margaret folded her hands. That would give Jonah significant legal control over the property. My mother waved her hand gently. "Oh, but families don't think about control that way." She placed a warm hand briefly on my shoulder, performing the gesture of maternal affection for the benefit of the watching guests. Jonah has always been generous. The word generous drifted into the room like a carefully chosen decoration. Generosity implies choice, but it also implies recognition. Oliver seemed to consider that for a moment. Then he asked another quiet question. Did the arrangement ever change? My father answered quickly. There was never any need. Daniel added with a small laugh. We all trusted each other. The sentence lingered. Trust. Oliver nodded thoughtfully. Trust is valuable in property agreements. Margaret's gaze moved slowly between the three of them, especially when large assets are involved. The slideshow behind us clicked again. This time the photograph showed a family Christmas dinner from years earlier. My parents at the head of the table, Daniel raising a glass, my chair at the far end, barely visible. The caption read, "Our perfect home." Several guests turned briefly to admire the festive image, but the conversation near the dessert table had grown too interesting to ignore. One of the neighbors, a quiet accountant named Peter, who lived across the street from my parents, spoke up hesitantly. If Jonah holds the title and the mortgage, he paused, realizing he might be stepping into unfamiliar territory. Margaret finished the thought for him. Then legally, the property belongs to Jonah. The sentence settled heavily. My mother's smile tightened again. Legal definitions can be misleading. My father nodded firmly. Exactly. Families share assets all the time. But Oliver Grant tilted his head slightly. Sharing usually involves multiple names on the documents. He let the observation sit for a moment before continuing. Your son's name appears to be the only one listed. My father's jaw shifted slightly. Temporary technicality. Daniel jumped in again. Paperwork doesn't reflect real family dynamics. A few guests nodded politely, but Margaret looked unconvinced. Jonah, she said gently, has the ownership ever been transferred back? I shook my head. No. The word was quiet, but it carried across the small circle with surprising clarity. Margaret exhaled slowly. I see. Oliver studied me for another moment, and then something like quiet amusement appeared in his expression. Because he had finally reached the part of the story that interested him most. Earlier this evening, he said thoughtfully, Elaine introduced Jonah as the family's maid. A faint ripple of awkward laughter moved through the group. My mother raised her hands apologetically. Just a joke. Oliver nodded. Of course. Then he took a small sip of wine and added the observation that finally forced the entire room to reconsider the evening. Though it is an unusual situation. Several guests leaned closer. Oliver looked around the group with polite curiosity. I can't recall meeting many household staff members who quietly hold the mortgage to the property they're supposedly cleaning. The silence that followed felt almost physical. Daniel shifted again. My mother opened her mouth, searching for another charming explanation. My father looked at the floor for a fraction of a second before regaining his composure. Across the room, more guests had started noticing the unusual stillness gathering around the dessert table. Because the polite story that had carried this family for years had just collided with a simple fact. The person they had introduced as a servant was legally the owner of the house everyone in Bristol admired. And for the first time that evening, people were beginning to wonder how many other details in the Fletcher family story might not survive a closer look. Part 8. Once people start questioning a story, they rarely stop with just one detail. It begins quietly, a small pause here, a glance exchanged there. Conversations shift tone. Words that once passed easily through the air suddenly feel heavier, as if everyone is examining them for hidden meanings. The dessert table had become the center of that shift. Across the room, the retirement slideshow continued its slow rotation of curated memories. The music still played softly, glasses still clinked. But the attention of half the guests had drifted toward the small circle forming around my parents. Oliver Grant had not moved. He stood comfortably beside the table, one hand resting lightly against the edge as though he had simply stumbled into an interesting discussion during an otherwise ordinary evening. Margaret, the solicitor, looked thoughtful in the way professionals do when a puzzle begins to reveal its structure. Several neighbors stood nearby, pretending to focus on their desserts while clearly listening to every word. My mother understood something was slipping. She lifted her champagne glass again, smiling with renewed brightness. "Well, this has become far too serious for a retirement party," she said. "Jonah has always been terribly responsible. We're proud of him, of course." Proud. It was the first time she'd used the word all evening. Daniel nodded quickly. "Absolutely. Right, he's always liked managing things behind the scenes. Behind the scenes." My father added with forced calm. "And of course, family arrangements are private matters." Margaret smiled politely. "They often are," but she was still studying the situation. Oliver Grant spoke again, his tone almost conversational. "Jonah, when did you begin flying long-haul contracts?" The question sounded unrelated at first, but Oliver had the mind of someone who understood timelines. I answered without hesitation. "Around the same time the property transferred." He nodded slowly. "That would explain the income verification necessary for a mortgage of that size." My father shifted his weight. "Pilots earn well when they're young and adventurous." Daniel added another light laugh. Jonah was practically living in airports back then. The comments were meant to shrink the significance of the financial detail. But Oliver was already connecting pieces. Flying internationally, high income, property ownership, and a family publicly describing the same person as household help. Margaret tapped her finger thoughtfully against the stem of her glass. "Jonah, may I ask something else?" "Of course. You said you secured the mortgage. Did your parents contribute to the payments afterward?" The question was careful, respectful, but extremely precise. My mother answered before I could. "We all contributed in our own ways." Daniel nodded. "Family teamwork." But Margaret looked back at me. The question had been directed to one person. I shook my head slightly. "No." The word landed softly, but it created another ripple of quiet reactions around the group. Oliver glanced at my father. "So the payments have been entirely Jonah's responsibility." My father straightened slightly. "That was the arrangement. Temporary." The word returned again. Temporary. Margaret looked thoughtful. 9 years of payments would represent a significant investment. Daniel shrugged. Jonah never minded. Another attempt to paint the situation as casual generosity. But Oliver's curiosity had clearly shifted into something deeper. He had begun the evening as a guest. Now he looked more like an analyst reviewing a very strange case study. And he asked the next question almost absently, as though thinking aloud. What originally caused the property to be transferred to Jonah's name? The room grew still again, because this question reached the part of the story my parents had never liked discussing. My father cleared his throat. It was a financial precaution. Daniel nodded. Exactly. Dad was moving some investments around. Margaret waited patiently. Financial precaution from what? My mother laughed again, though the sound was thinner than before. Oh, Margaret, you're interrogating us like a courtroom. Margaret smiled gently. Old habits. But she didn't withdraw the question. Oliver looked between my parents and then back to me. And that was when I noticed something else. He wasn't trying to embarrass them, he was genuinely curious. Because the situation he had just uncovered did not fit the narrative he had been hearing all evening. The successful parents, the dependent child, the hard-working family supported by sacrifice. Instead, the facts were suggesting something very different. A young pilot quietly assuming responsibility for a house his parents publicly claimed as their achievement. Daniel tried to redirect the conversation. Anyway, Jonah has always been independent. That's why he's rarely home. Several guests nodded politely, but Oliver wasn't finished. When someone carries a mortgage for 9 years, he said thoughtfully, that suggests more than independence. Margaret added quietly, it suggests obligation. My mother placed her glass down with careful control. Families help each other during difficult periods. Her voice carried a subtle edge now. Oliver nodded, of course. Then he asked the question that finally pushed the conversation closer to the truth everyone had been circling around. What difficult period required a 26-year-old pilot to assume full financial responsibility for his parents' house? The room seemed to inhale, because suddenly the evening had reached a point where polite answers might not be enough anymore. Across the hall, another photograph appeared on the slideshow. My parents standing proudly in front of the Clifton house again. But now the caption beneath it, "Built on sacrifice," looked slightly different to the people gathered near the dessert table, because they were starting to realize something unsettling. The sacrifice in that photograph might not belong to the people smiling in it. And if that was true, then the story the Fletcher family had been telling Bristol for 20 years was about to become far more complicated than anyone at this retirement party had expected. Part 9. Some questions do not demand answers immediately. They simply sit in the air and wait. Oliver Grant's question had that quality. What difficult period required a 26-year-old pilot to assume full financial responsibility for his parents' house? No one spoke for several seconds. The silence was not dramatic, not confrontational. It was the kind of pause that spreads slowly through a room when people begin realizing a conversation has wandered somewhere unexpected. My father finally exhaled through his nose and smiled again. "Financial markets were volatile back then," he said. "Anyone who invested during that period remembers the uncertainty." Several guests nodded cautiously. It was a safe explanation, broad enough to feel true without offering specific details. Daniel added quickly, "Dad had a few investments tied up at the time. Nothing unusual." My mother lifted her glass again, and Jonah happened to be in a position to help temporarily. Temporarily. The word returned like a small anchor they hoped would stabilize the narrative. Margaret, the solicitor, didn't challenge them immediately. She had the patience of someone used to watching complicated explanations slowly assemble themselves. Oliver Grant tilted his head slightly. "What kind of investments?" My father answered smoothly. "Property funds, development partnerships, standard portfolio diversification." The phrases sounded impressive enough. But Oliver had spent decades listening to executives describe losses without using the word loss. And something about the structure of the explanation made him curious. "Development partnerships can collapse rather suddenly," he said. My father's smile thinned. "Markets carry risk." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, but transferring a family home into a child's name usually happens when lenders become nervous." Daniel shifted slightly. "You're making it sound like a financial crisis." Margaret shrugged gently. "I'm simply following the logic of the paperwork." The slideshow behind us moved to another photograph. This one showed a garden party from years earlier. My parents surrounded by neighbors, Daniel laughing beside them. I was somewhere in the background, barely visible near the edge of the frame. The caption read, "Our wonderful community." Across the room, some of those same neighbors were now standing within earshot of the dessert table, and they were listening. Oliver looked back at me. "Jonah, did the bank require the transfer?" My mother spoke immediately. "It was a family decision." Oliver nodded slowly. "Of course," but his eyes remained on me. The truth was not particularly dramatic, which made it easier to say. "The bank required it," I said. The sentence landed quietly. Margaret's eyebrows lifted slightly. "I see." My father's smile returned again, though it looked more rigid now. "Banks were extremely cautious after the market downturn," Daniel added with forced humor. "They practically required blood samples back then." A few guests chuckled politely, but Oliver's attention sharpened. "So the house was at risk?" My father waved the idea away. "Nothing so dramatic." Margaret looked at him carefully. "Yet the mortgage had to be reassigned." Another pause settled over the group. 9 years earlier. That had been the moment when the Fletcher family's carefully balanced finances had tilted. My father's development partnerships had collapsed quietly when a regional project failed to secure final funding. It had not been a scandal, just a series of unfortunate financial dominoes. But lenders had become nervous, and nervous lenders sometimes demand immediate restructuring, which is how a 26-year-old commercial pilot had ended up signing documents that transferred a Clifton property into his own name. Daniel cleared his throat. Jonah had good income verification at the time. My mother nodded quickly. He was traveling constantly. Excellent salary. Margaret glanced back at the phone still in my hand, and he assumed the mortgage completely. Yes. Oliver took a slow sip of wine. Impressive responsibility for someone so young. My father chuckled. Jonah has always been the adventurous type. The line felt tired now. Several guests exchanged quiet glances, because the picture forming in their minds was different from the one displayed on the slideshow. In the photographs, my parents were the architects of the family's success. In the documents, the foundation looked slightly different. Oliver rested his glass on the table. May I ask something else? My mother forced another smile. This evening is turning into quite an audit. Oliver returned the smile politely, professional curiosity. Then he asked the question that quietly shifted the story another inch closer to its real shape. Jonah, when the mortgage was transferred, did your parents ever repay the original loan balance you assumed? The words were gentle, but their meaning landed heavily. Daniel answered quickly. Of course, we've all contributed. Margaret looked thoughtful again. Mortgage repayments tend to leave clear financial records. My father's voice grew firmer. This conversation is becoming unnecessarily detailed. Oliver nodded in agreement. Perhaps, but he looked back at me once more, and when he spoke again, the tone had changed slightly. Less curious, more analytical. Jonah, he said, if the mortgage began 9 years ago and the payments have remained consistent. He paused briefly, doing the quiet mental math executives often perform when reviewing balance sheets. Then the realization appeared in his expression. You must be quite close to owning the property outright. The statement drifted across the table like a slow-moving cloud. Margaret blinked once. Daniel looked at me. My mother's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her glass. My father did not move at all. Because everyone in that small circle had just reached the same conclusion at exactly the same moment. The Clifton house, the one my parents had proudly presented all evening as the reward for their sacrifice, was not simply in my name. It was almost completely paid off, and the person who had quietly carried that responsibility for nearly a decade was the same one they had introduced to their wealthy neighbors 15 minutes earlier as the Maid. Part 10. There's a particular kind of silence that only appears when a room begins recalculating everything it thought it understood. Not shock, not outrage, something quieter. People adjusting mental equations. Oliver Grant's observation had done exactly that. You must be quite close to owning the property outright. No one rushed to contradict him, because the numbers were simple enough for everyone in the circle to estimate. 9 years of mortgage payments. Commercial pilot income. A Clifton property purchased before prices surged. The math pointed toward the same quiet conclusion. Margaret the solicitor broke the silence first. Well, that would certainly explain the title structure. Her voice carried the calm tone of someone who had just finished assembling the last pieces of a puzzle. My father forced a laugh. Mortgage schedules can extend for decades. Daniel nodded. Exactly. Plenty of time left on that loan. But Margaret had already looked again at the payment history on my phone. Monthly deposits. Regular. Uninterrupted. 9 years of quiet consistency. Jonah, she said gently. Have you missed any payments? I shook my head. No. Oliver lifted his eyebrows slightly. Impressive discipline. My mother set her champagne glass down again. Jonah has always been methodical. The compliment sounded unfamiliar coming from her. Daniel leaned back against the table, attempting a relaxed smile. Our brother enjoys spreadsheets more than people. A few polite chuckles drifted through the group. But the tension remained. Across the room, more guests had begun glancing toward the dessert table. Conversations elsewhere were growing quieter as word spread that something unusual was unfolding. Oliver studied me for another moment. Then he asked a question that sounded almost casual. How much of the principal remains? My father spoke immediately. Oliver, surely that's private information. Oliver nodded. Of course. He looked back at me. You don't have to answer. But the truth was simple. I unlocked the phone again, scrolled. The document opened automatically where I had last viewed it. Remaining balance minimal. The number itself was not dramatic, just small enough to confirm what Oliver had already suspected. Margaret leaned closer. Good heavens. My mother's smile returned with determined brightness. Mortgage calculators can be misleading. Daniel laughed softly. Jonah always liked paying ahead. The explanation arrived quickly, but Oliver Grant was still reading the numbers. Then he leaned back slightly. So the house is almost entirely yours. The statement landed with quiet finality. Several guests nearby inhaled softly, because once spoken aloud, the implication became impossible to ignore. The house, the Clifton property. The one displayed proudly on the slideshow behind us. The one my parents had described all evening as the product of their sacrifice, was almost entirely owned by the person they had just introduced as household staff. My father straightened his jacket. Families don't view property in such transactional terms. Margaret smiled gently. Property law tends to. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. This conversation is getting ridiculous. Oliver raised a hand slightly. No criticism intended. He looked around the small circle of listeners. I simply find the structure fascinating. Several neighbors exchanged curious glances. Peter, the accountant, spoke quietly. So Jonah has been paying for the house the whole time? Daniel sighed. He volunteered. My mother nodded quickly. Jonah insisted. The two explanations overlapped slightly. Margaret noticed. Insisted? My mother smiled again. He wanted to help the family. The phrasing sounded smoother now, less like an obligation, more like generosity. But Oliver's expression had shifted again, because one piece of the puzzle still did not align with the rest. He gestured lightly toward the slideshow still playing across the room. Forgive my curiosity. Everyone turned toward the screen. Another photograph of the Clifton house had appeared, this one from the front garden. My parents standing proudly beside the stone gate. The caption read, Martin and Elaine's dream home. Oliver looked back at them. If Jonah owns the property, he paused briefly, then asked the question that quietly unsettled the entire story once again. Why does every photograph tonight describe it as yours? The room became very still. My mother laughed softly. Oh, Oliver, a simple rhetorical flourish. Daniel nodded. Marketing language. My father smiled again. Family pride. The three explanations arrived almost simultaneously, but none of them sounded quite convincing anymore. Margaret watched them carefully. Marketing language usually isn't used at retirement parties. A few guests shifted uncomfortably because the slideshow had just become something else entirely, not a celebration. Evidence. Oliver glanced at the screen again, then back at me. Jonah, his tone was gentle. Have you ever corrected that story? The question was not confrontational. It carried genuine curiosity. I considered it for a moment, then answered honestly. No. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Why not? The answer came easily, because arguing about feelings never changes anything. Oliver studied me, then nodded slowly. Facts do. The simple observation settled into the room like a quiet verdict. Across the hall, the slideshow advanced again. Another photograph, another caption about sacrifice. But now the audience watching it understood something they hadn't known at the beginning of the evening. The foundation of that story belonged to someone else, and the person who actually held the facts had not even begun using them yet. Which meant the retirement party my parents had carefully planned to reinforce their legacy was slowly becoming the first public moment that legacy began to unravel. Part 11. The slideshow continued to move forward, unaware that the story it was trying to tell had already begun slipping apart. Photograph after photograph appeared on the large white screen. Holidays in Cornwall, Daniel's graduation, anniversary dinners, garden parties in Clifton. Every image carried the same quiet message. Success. Sacrifice. A life carefully built by Martin and Elaine Fletcher. But now the audience watching those images had information the slideshow did not. A few guests still clapped politely when a new photo appeared, though the applause sounded thinner than before. Conversations around the room had softened into quieter tones, because something subtle had happened at the dessert table. The narrative had cracked. Margaret stood with her arms folded lightly, still thinking through the legal implications of what she had heard. Peter the accountant looked like someone mentally recalculating a balance sheet he had always assumed was accurate. Oliver Grant, meanwhile, had grown very quiet. Executives often did that when they realized the situation was more complex than it first appeared. My mother noticed the shift. She was far too experienced socially not to. And she made a quick decision. "Let's not turn Jonah into the center of the evening," she said brightly, raising her voice slightly so the surrounding guests could hear. "Tonight is about Martin's retirement." Several people nodded politely. My father lifted his glass. "Here, here, here." Daniel clapped him on the shoulder. 40 years of hard work. The attention of the room drifted back toward the front of the hall where the microphone stood waiting beside the projector table. The formal speeches were scheduled to begin. My mother stepped forward smoothly, reclaiming the host's role she had nearly lost. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said warmly, "if I could have your attention for just a moment." Guests turned toward her. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips. Even Oliver shifted slightly to face the front. My mother smiled out across the room. "We're so grateful to see so many friends here tonight. Martin has spent decades serving this community and building a life we're incredibly proud of." Her voice was confident again. Rehearsed. The familiar performance had resumed. Behind her, the slideshow paused on another photograph of the Clifton house. My father stood beside her, straightening his jacket as if stepping back into his proper role. Daniel moved toward the microphone stand, ready to adjust it for his father. Everything looked normal again. But those standing closest to the dessert table understood something the rest of the room had not yet realized. The earlier conversation had changed the context of every word about to be spoken. My mother gestured toward the screen. "This home, this family, everything we've built, it's been the result of dedication and sacrifice." Several guests applauded. The line would have sounded perfectly natural 30 minutes earlier. Now it carried a faint echo of the discussion that had just unfolded. Oliver Grant stood with his arms loosely folded, watching with quiet interest. Margaret remained beside him, eyes thoughtful. My father stepped forward to the microphone. "Thank you, everyone." His voice carried the steady confidence of a man who had given speeches for years. "When Elaine and I bought our home in Clifton," the sentence had barely begun when Margaret's eyebrow lifted slightly. A few guests near the dessert table exchanged subtle glances. "Bought." The word was technically correct in a distant past sense, but the present tense of ownership was more complicated. My father continued smoothly. "We believed in building something lasting for our family." Applause rippled politely through the room. Daniel nodded proudly beside him. My mother beamed, and I stood quietly at the back again, hands folded behind my back, watching the performance resume. Oliver leaned slightly toward Margaret. He spoke quietly enough that only those closest could hear. "Fascinating." Margaret nodded. "Yes," because now that the facts had entered the room, every line of the speech sounded slightly different. My father spoke about perseverance, about financial discipline, about providing for his children, and each phrase brushed lightly against the quiet knowledge several listeners now held. The house, the mortgage, the title, 9 years of payments. My mother stepped forward again when the applause faded. "Family means everything to us," she said warmly. Her eyes moved briefly across the room. When they reached me, the smile sharpened slightly. "Our children have always supported the household in their own ways." Several guests nodded politely. Daniel raised his glass. "Jonah especially has always been helpful." The room chuckled softly. "Helpful." The word had become the evening's most flexible description. Oliver exhaled slowly through his nose, amused. Margaret leaned closer. I suspect the documentation would use a different term. Oliver nodded. Primary owner. The speech continued. More stories, more applause, more carefully polished memories. But something else had begun spreading through the audience. Curiosity. Because a few people now understood that the foundation of this celebration might not belong to the speakers at the microphone. And curiosity is a difficult thing to contain once it starts moving through a room. Eventually, someone asks another question. Someone who had been listening quietly from the edge of the crowd. Someone who knew just enough about the Fletcher family to notice something unusual. That question came from an older man near the second row of tables. He raised his hand slightly as the applause faded again. Martin, he said. My father smiled down from the microphone. Yes, Harold? The man cleared his throat politely. I've lived 2 houses down from you for nearly 15 years. My father nodded warmly. Of course. The neighbor hesitated. Then asked the simple question that pushed the evening one step closer to a very public realization. If Jonah owns the house now, why have we always been told you paid it off yourselves? Part 12. A room full of people can change direction with a single question. Harold's voice had not been loud. It had not carried accusation or anger. In fact, he sounded almost apologetic, the way neighbors often do when they realize they might be stepping into something private. But his question had already done its work. If Jonah owns the house now, why have we always been told you paid it off yourselves? The microphone in my father's hand suddenly seemed heavier. Across the hall, a few conversations stopped mid-sentence. Wine glasses hovered in the air as people instinctively turned their attention back toward the front of the room. My father stood very still. For a moment, the practiced rhythm of his speech faltered. Then he smiled again. The kind of smile that had carried him through countless financial presentations and community meetings. Harold, he said warmly, property structures can sometimes be misunderstood. The answer sounded smooth enough. But several people near the dessert table had already heard too much detail for that explanation to settle easily. Harold nodded slowly. Perhaps. He didn't sit down, which meant the question had not fully satisfied him. Margaret folded her arms thoughtfully beside Oliver. Oliver's eyes moved calmly between the microphone, the slideshow screen, and the guests gathered around the room. My mother stepped forward quickly, placing a reassuring hand on my father's arm. What Martin means, she said with her usual polished brightness, is that families often arrange their finances in different ways. The explanation sounded rehearsed. Daniel stepped closer to the microphone. Exactly. Dad handled the investments. Jonah handled some paperwork for a while. A few guests nodded politely. But Harold was still standing. Yes, he said. But paperwork doesn't usually mean paying a mortgage for nearly a decade. The sentence hung there. Several people glanced toward the dessert table where Margaret and Oliver stood, because they had been part of the earlier conversation, and word had already begun moving quietly between guests. My father chuckled again. Jonah has always been generous. The word generous appeared once more, a convenient explanation. But Oliver Grant's voice rose gently from the back of the room. Generosity tends to leave financial trails. Heads turned. Even those who had not been paying close attention earlier now noticed the tall man standing beside the solicitor near the dessert table. My father recognized him immediately. Mr. Grant, Oliver nodded politely. Please don't misunderstand. I'm not criticizing your family arrangement. His voice remained calm, conversational. But when significant assets are involved, clarity tends to matter, Margaret added gently. Especially when neighbors believe the property has already been fully paid off. Harold nodded again. That's what we were told when Martin refinanced years ago. My father's smile tightened. Neighborhood conversations can sometimes simplify complex situations. Daniel leaned toward the microphone. Look, this is turning into something ridiculous. It was just an internal family matter. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. My mother tried again to redirect the evening. "Why don't we focus on celebrating Martin tonight?" Applause rippled weakly through the room. But the curiosity that had taken hold earlier had not disappeared. Once people realize they may have misunderstood something for years, they naturally want to correct the record. Margaret spoke again, her voice calm but precise. "Martin, forgive the professional curiosity. But when Jonah assumed the mortgage, was there an agreement regarding repayment?" The room quieted again, because this question moved beyond pride. It entered the territory of responsibility. My father hesitated, just briefly. "We had an understanding." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "And that understanding was fulfilled?" Daniel answered quickly. "Of course." But Margaret did not look convinced. Mortgage payments usually leave a clear financial history. Oliver spoke again, still calm. "Earlier this evening, Jonah mentioned he made the payments himself." All eyes turned toward me again. I had remained near the back of the room, exactly where my mother had hoped I would stay all evening. Invisible. But invisibility had become impossible now. My mother's smile returned, though the edges looked tight. Jonah never minded helping the family. The line sounded familiar now, almost rehearsed. But Harold spoke again before the moment could settle. "Helping is one thing." He gestured lightly toward the slideshow still paused behind my father. "Owning the house is another." The words echoed softly. Owning the house. The phrase had not yet been spoken into the microphone that evening, but now everyone in the room had heard it. My father's posture stiffened slightly. "Jonah holds the title for administrative reasons." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Administrative reasons rarely involve full mortgage responsibility." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "This conversation has become unnecessarily detailed." Oliver smiled faintly. "Sometimes details clarify stories." The sentence floated across the room like a quiet observation rather than a challenge. My father looked out across the audience. Dozens of familiar faces stared back at him. Neighbors, colleagues, friends. People who had believed the Fletcher family narrative for years. And now those same people were waiting. Not angrily, just curiously. Because curiosity had already replaced the comfortable assumptions that once filled the room. My mother stepped closer to the microphone again. "Jonah has always been a wonderful son." She glanced toward me briefly, the kind who helps when family needs support. Her voice softened, and we've always been grateful for that. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement she had offered all evening. But Oliver Grant tilted his head slightly. Gratitude usually appears in public introductions. The observation landed quietly. Several guests remembered the moment earlier when she had pointed toward me and used a very different description. My mother's expression froze for a fraction of a second. Oliver continued gently. "Particularly when the person providing support happens to own the house, everyone is celebrating tonight." The room went very still, because the truth had finally crossed the invisible boundary between private conversation and public recognition. Now everyone in the room knew. And once a room full of witnesses understands the same fact at the same time, the story that tried to hide it rarely survives much longer. Part 13. When a truth becomes public, it doesn't explode. It spreads, slowly, quietly, like ink through water. The moment Oliver Grant's words settled across the room, the atmosphere inside the Harbor Hall shifted in a way no one could reverse. Particularly when the person providing support happens to own the house, everyone is celebrating tonight. No one laughed, no one rushed to speak. The retirement slideshow still glowed on the screen behind my father, yet displaying a photograph of the Clifton house bathed in warm evening sunlight. But now the caption beneath it, "Martin and Elaine's dream home," looked strangely out of place. A few guests leaned closer together, whispering quietly. Others simply stared at the front of the room, waiting to see what my parents would do next. My father remained standing at the microphone. For the first time that evening, he looked like a man searching for words instead of delivering them. My mother stepped forward quickly. Her smile returned with determined brightness. "Well," she said lightly, "I think tonight proves how lucky we are to have such a generous son." The sentence was carefully designed. It reframed the conversation instantly, from ownership to generosity, from responsibility to kindness. Several guests nodded politely. It was an elegant pivot. But Margaret the solicitor had spent 40 years watching people attempt elegant pivots in courtrooms, and she understood the difference between gratitude and deflection. "Generous indeed," she said thoughtfully. 9 years of mortgage payments is quite a contribution. Daniel shifted beside the microphone. Jonah never made a big deal about it. His voice carried a faint edge now, because the story was slipping out of the shape he had always known. Oliver Grant watched the exchange calmly. People who managed large organizations often develop patience for moments like this. He wasn't rushing the conversation. He was simply observing it unfold. My father cleared his throat. Jonah helped the family during a complicated financial period. The sentence sounded firmer now, more controlled. A statement meant to stabilize the room. But Harold, the neighbor who had asked the original question, spoke again from his seat. "Martin, I remember that period." My father nodded stiffly. "Yes, you mentioned refinancing," Harold continued. "Said the investments were tied up temporarily." A few other neighbors nodded as well. People remember conversations that involve large houses and financial uncertainty. Daniel stepped closer to the microphone, and Jonah stepped in to help. My mother nodded quickly. "Exactly. Family support." Margaret looked toward me again. "Jonah, did the bank require the mortgage to be transferred because the original loan was in danger?" Her voice was gentle, but precise. I nodded. Yes, a faint murmur spread through the audience, because the sentence confirmed something people had only suspected before. The Clifton house, the pride of the Fletcher family for 2 decades, had once been close to slipping away. Oliver Grant folded his arms lightly, and Jonah prevented that. My father spoke again more firmly. Jonah was in a fortunate financial position at the time. The phrasing was deliberate. Fortunate, as though circumstances had simply aligned. But Margaret asked another quiet question. Was the loan ever transferred back after the situation stabilized? No one answered immediately. Daniel glanced toward my father. My mother looked at the floor for a moment before lifting her chin again. The room waited, because this was the point where the narrative either returned to safety or drifted somewhere new. I spoke before either of them could. No. The word echoed softly through the microphone speakers. My father turned toward me sharply. Daniel stared. My mother's smile faded slightly. Margaret nodded slowly. "I see." Oliver's expression remained calm, though there was unmistakable interest in his eyes now. So Jonah assumed the financial responsibility, and it remained his. The conclusion sounded simple, but simplicity often carries the sharpest edge. Several guests shifted in their seats, because the picture had changed again. Earlier in the evening, the Fletcher family had appeared to be celebrating a lifetime of careful financial success. Now it looked more like something else entirely. A crisis quietly resolved by the person standing at the back of the room. My mother tried once more to soften the moment. Jonah never cared about recognition. The line was delivered gently, almost affectionately. But Oliver Grant tilted his head slightly. Recognition tends to follow facts eventually. The words were not unkind, just accurate. Harold spoke again from the second row. "So Jonah owns the house now?" My father straightened. "Ownership within a family can be a technical matter." Margaret gave a small smile. "Technical matters are usually the ones recorded in land registries." A few quiet chuckles moved through the audience. Not mocking, just the sound of people realizing something obvious. Daniel rubbed his temples briefly. This has become absurd. But the evening had already moved beyond that point. Oliver looked toward me again. "Jonah." His tone remained calm. "How much remains on the mortgage?" The question hung in the air. My parents both looked at me immediately, because they knew the answer. They had seen the same documents years earlier, but the rest of the room had not. and suddenly dozens of people were waiting to hear it. Not out of hostility, out of curiosity. Because the story of the Fletcher family had just shifted from polite retirement celebration to something far more interesting. A quiet financial mystery that had apparently been hiding in plain sight for nearly a decade. I stepped forward slowly toward the front of the room. The floor felt strangely quiet under my shoes as I crossed the space between the back wall and the microphone. My father watched me carefully. My mother's fingers tightened slightly around her glass. Daniel stood frozen beside the projector table. Oliver Grant remained where he was, observing with the calm focus of someone who suspected the next detail might finally explain everything. I reached the front of the room, looked briefly at the slideshow still glowing behind us, then answered Oliver's question. Very little. The words were simple, but they carried through the speakers clearly enough for everyone to hear. Margaret nodded slowly. Then the house will be fully yours soon. The sentence settled across the audience like the final piece of a puzzle, because now there was no confusion left, no complicated technicalities, just one very clear fact. The house my parents had spent the entire evening presenting as the symbol of their life's achievement was about to belong entirely to the son they had introduced 15 minutes earlier as the Maid, Part 14. The microphone amplified silence in a way no one expected. After I said very little, the room did not erupt into noise or outrage. Instead, it grew quieter than it had been all evening. The kind of stillness that happens when dozens of people arrive at the same conclusion at the same time. Margaret's calm observation hung in the air. Then the house will be fully yours soon. For several seconds, no one moved. Behind us, the slideshow shifted to another image of the Clifton property. A summer photograph this time, sunlight across the garden lawn, my parents standing near the stone wall as though posing beside a monument they had built with their own hands. But now that image felt strangely out of alignment with the room watching it. My father cleared his throat. Mortgages often approach completion over time, he said. His voice had regained some of its usual steadiness, but the authority behind it felt thinner. Daniel nodded quickly. Exactly. That doesn't change the fact that it's our family home. Family home. A subtle shift in wording. No longer Martin and Elaine's house. Now the family's house. My mother stepped forward again, resting a gentle hand on my father's shoulder. And Jonah has always understood that, she said warmly. The phrase sounded like reassurance, but it also carried an unspoken expectation. Oliver Grant watched the exchange quietly. Executives learned long ago that the most revealing moments in negotiations happen right after the facts become clear. Margaret glanced at me again. Jonah, may I ask something slightly delicate? Of course. When the mortgage is complete, will the title remain in your name? The question was not confrontational, but it moved the conversation forward by exactly one logical step. Several guests leaned forward slightly, because this was the moment where generosity, obligation, and legal ownership finally met. My father answered quickly. Of course, the house remains part of the family. Margaret nodded politely, but the title holder determines that. Daniel added with forced casualness, Jonah's not planning to throw anyone out, if that's what you're implying. A few nervous laughs rippled through the room, but Margaret shook her head gently, not implying anything, simply clarifying legal reality. Oliver's eyes remained on me, because he understood something the rest of the room was only beginning to see. The evening had moved past embarrassment. Now it was about control. The control created by quiet paperwork signed years earlier. My mother smiled at me across the small space between the microphone and the front row. Jonah has always been very loyal to the family. The sentence carried more weight than any spoken before it. Loyal. It was not quite a compliment, not quite a request. Something in between. I could feel dozens of eyes on me now. Neighbors, former colleagues of my father, friends who had attended birthday parties and holiday dinners in the Clifton house for years. People who had never imagined that the ownership structure of that house might look different than they assumed. Oliver broke the silence. Jonah. His voice was calm. When the mortgage concludes, do you intend to transfer the property back to your parents? The question was direct, but it did not sound aggressive. It sounded like the kind of practical question someone asks when reviewing a contract. My father looked at me sharply. Daniel stared. My mother's smile held perfectly still. The room waited, not impatiently, just curiously, because everyone understood that the answer would explain the entire situation in one sentence. I thought about it for a moment, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I knew exactly how the room would hear it. Across the hall, the slideshow advanced again. Another photograph of the Clifton house appeared. This one taken at sunset. The caption beneath it read, "A lifetime of hard work." I glanced briefly at the screen, then back at the audience. "No," I said calmly. The word moved through the speakers like a soft current of electricity. Daniel blinked. My father's jaw tightened slightly. My mother's smile finally faded. Margaret did not look surprised. She simply nodded once, as though a question she had been quietly considering had now received its answer. Oliver Grant exhaled slowly through his nose. Not quite amusement, not quite approval, just recognition, because he had just witnessed something unusual. Not revenge, not anger, simply a fact spoken without drama. The house would remain under the ownership of the person who had carried its financial weight. Several guests exchanged glances. Peter the accountant leaned toward the neighbor beside him and whispered something that caused both of them to nod slowly. Harold sat back in his chair, absorbing the moment. My father stepped away from the microphone for a moment. Daniel looked like he might say something, but no words came. My mother spoke instead. "Jonah," she said carefully. "Perhaps this isn't the time to discuss such matters." Her tone was gentle again. But there was a subtle urgency beneath it, because the narrative she had built for decades was now balancing on a narrow edge. Oliver spoke quietly from the back. Sometimes timing chooses itself. Several guests glanced at him. He lifted his glass slightly. Facts have a way of appearing exactly when people are ready to hear them, Margaret added softly, particularly when those facts are written down. The room remained silent, but the emotional atmosphere had changed again. Earlier there had been curiosity. Now there was something else. Understanding. Because everyone present could finally see the structure of the story that had been hiding underneath the Fletcher family's polished image. And once people understood that structure, they naturally began wondering about something even more interesting. If Jonah had quietly carried the house for 9 years, what else in the Fletcher family story might not be exactly what it seemed? Daniel was the first to ask the question out loud. His voice came suddenly, sharper than before. "Fine," he said. "If you own the house now, Jonah, why did you wait until tonight to say anything?" Part 15. Daniel's question cut through the room with a sharpness none of the earlier conversations had carried. "Fine. If you own the house now, Jonah, why did you wait until tonight to say anything?" The microphone picked up every edge of the sentence. For the first time that evening, frustration had slipped into the Fletcher family's public voice. A few guests shifted in their seats, not because the question was unreasonable, because it revealed something deeper. Daniel had not asked whether the facts were true. He had asked why I had revealed them, which meant he already knew. My father stepped back toward the microphone quickly. "Daniel, that's enough." But Daniel wasn't finished. "No, Dad." He turned toward me. "Everyone here suddenly thinks we've been hiding something." His voice carried a tight energy now. "You could have explained the arrangement years ago." The room watched us carefully, because Daniel had unintentionally opened the door to the exact question Oliver Grant had been quietly waiting to hear answered. Oliver leaned slightly against the dessert table. "Yes," he said mildly. "Why tonight?" Margaret glanced toward him. Curious timing. My mother spoke carefully. "Jonah never cared about recognition." The line returned again, but this time the words sounded different. not an explanation, an accusation. I looked around the room, at neighbors who had visited the Clifton house for years, at former colleagues of my father who had listened politely to the retirement speech minutes earlier, at Oliver Grant watching with calm interest. Then I answered Daniel's question. I didn't bring it up tonight. The sentence carried clearly through the microphone speakers. A small ripple of realization passed through several guests. Daniel frowned. What? I turned slightly toward my mother. You did. The room became very still. My mother blinked. Jonah, when you introduced me, I continued calmly. You called me the Maid. A quiet murmur moved through the audience. Some guests had heard the moment earlier. Others had not. But now the sentence existed in the same space as all the other facts that had surfaced tonight. My mother's expression tightened. It was a joke. Oliver Grant's voice arrived softly from the back. Jokes tend to reveal assumptions. Margaret nodded faintly beside him. Daniel looked irritated. You're taking that way too seriously. Am I? I gestured slightly toward the screen behind us. The slideshow image had paused again on another photograph of the Clifton house. The caption beneath it read, "Built by dedication." Everyone in the room followed my glance. 9 years of mortgage payments, I said calmly. A few guests shifted in their chairs. Daniel crossed his arms. So what? So nothing. I shrugged slightly. I never argued about the story. My father spoke again, his voice controlled but firmer now. Jonah, this isn't the place for... I didn't start the conversation. Oliver raised his glass slightly. Technically, the conversation began with an introduction. A few quiet chuckles moved through the room. My mother looked briefly toward him, then back at me. You knew what I meant. Perhaps, I paused, but the room heard something else. The sentence landed gently. No accusation, just observation. And that observation did something remarkable, because suddenly every guest present could reconstruct the entire evening in their mind. The introduction, the laughter, the word Maid, the CEO who recognized me, the property registry, the mortgage, the ownership. Daniel rubbed his face with both hands. This is ridiculous. Margaret spoke calmly. It's actually quite straightforward. Oliver nodded slightly. Yes. The facts aligned neatly once they appeared. My father looked out across the audience again. Friends, neighbors, people whose opinions had mattered to him for decades. And he realized something that had not been true earlier that evening. The room was no longer listening to him. It was listening to the story, a story that had shifted entirely. My mother tried once more. Jonah has always been sensitive about family matters. The line sounded practiced, but Oliver asked another quiet question. Sensitive about what? No one answered immediately, because the answer to that question required revisiting the past in a way my parents had always avoided publicly. Daniel spoke again instead. You're acting like we exploited you or something. The sentence echoed sharply through the microphone. Several guests leaned forward slightly, because now the emotional center of the evening had shifted, from finances to something deeper. I looked at my brother. I never said that. He frowned. But that's what everyone's thinking now. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Are they? The room remained quiet. Oliver Grant's expression had grown thoughtful again, because he recognized something else unfolding, a dynamic older than mortgages or property titles, family narratives, the ones that reward certain children and quietly depend on others. Daniel gestured toward the slideshow screen. We built that life together, I nodded. Yes, the agreement was simple. The house stayed. The story stayed. And I stayed quiet. Several guests exchanged glances because the sentence explained something they had not fully understood before. Not revenge, not resentment, just silence maintained for years, until someone pushed the wrong detail into the open. Oliver spoke softly, and tonight someone did. My mother looked at him sharply. It was a joke. Oliver shrugged slightly. Some jokes reveal more than intended. The room held its breath again, because now everyone understood the real turning point of the evening. Not the mortgage, not the registry. A single introduction. The moment someone tried to shrink a person who held the quiet facts. Daniel shook his head. You're blowing this out of proportion. I looked at him calmly. I didn't say anything for 9 years. The sentence carried no anger, just time. And time has a way of making silence look very different once the truth appears. Margaret folded her hands. 9 years is a long time for silence, Oliver nodded. Usually people speak sooner. I glanced toward the harbor windows. The lights outside shimmered across the dark water. Sometimes there's no reason to speak earlier. Daniel frowned again. What changed? I looked back at him. Nothing changed. I paused briefly. Except tonight, I finally had witnesses. The words settled into the room like the first crack of thunder before a storm, because everyone present understood something suddenly. The Fletcher family story had survived for decades because it had always been told in private rooms. But tonight, the wrong audience had been present. Neighbors, professionals, a solicitor, and the CEO of the company that had just hired the son they tried to introduce as a servant, which meant the story was no longer controlled by the people who created it. And once a story escapes its creators, it rarely returns to the same shape again. Part 16. The word witnesses lingered in the air longer than anything else spoken that evening. Not accusations, not anger, just a quiet statement of reality. Except tonight, I finally had witnesses. The microphone carried the sentence gently across the room, and for a moment, no one responded. The harbor lights outside the tall windows flickered softly against the water, and the slideshow behind us shifted to yet another photograph of the Clifton house. But no one was looking at the screen anymore. Everyone was looking at the Fletcher family. Daniel stared at me, still trying to decide whether he'd been insulted or outmaneuvered. My father stood beside the microphone, jaw tight, posture rigid, in a way I had only seen a handful of times growing up, usually when a conversation had moved beyond his ability to steer it. My mother held her glass in both hands now, not sipping, just holding. Oliver Grant broke the silence first. Witnesses are useful things, he said calmly. His voice carried easily across the room, even without the microphone. Margaret nodded beside him, particularly when documentation is involved. Daniel shook his head. You're acting like this is some kind of courtroom. Margaret smiled faintly. Property disputes often resemble them. My father stepped forward again. This is not a dispute. His voice carried the firmness of someone trying to restore order. The house remains part of our family. Several guests shifted slightly. The statement sounded reassuring, but now that everyone knew the legal structure behind it, the words had a different texture. Oliver tilted his head thoughtfully. Family membership doesn't automatically transfer property titles. Daniel sighed loudly. We're not talking about legal loopholes. No, Oliver said calmly. We're talking about facts. The room grew quiet again, because the facts were no longer mysterious. They had been laid out piece by piece throughout the evening. Mortgage responsibility, title ownership, 9 years of payments. Margaret glanced toward the slideshow screen again. The image had returned to the photograph of my parents standing proudly beside the garden wall. Martin and Elaine's dream home. She nodded slightly toward the screen. It's interesting how stories develop. My mother's voice tightened. What do you mean by that? Margaret gestured gently toward the photograph. For years, everyone in this neighborhood believed that house represented Martin's financial success. A few neighbors nodded slowly. Harold folded his arms. That's what we were told. Daniel looked irritated again. It still does. Margaret looked back at him. In a way, yes. She paused briefly, but the financial reality appears slightly different. Oliver added quietly, Jonah carried the risk. The sentence landed softly, but its meaning traveled through the room like a ripple through still water. Because that word, risk, explained something people had not fully considered until now. Risk meant responsibility. Risk meant consequences if payments failed. Risk meant the person who signed the documents stood to lose the most. My father cleared his throat. Jonah volunteered to help the family. Oliver nodded, and did so successfully. Daniel crossed his arms again. Exactly. But Oliver's next sentence shifted the conversation again. Success tends to create ownership. The words were calm, simple, difficult to argue with. My mother looked toward me again. Jonah has always understood that family loyalty matters more than paperwork. The sentence sounded softer than her earlier comments, almost hopeful. But Oliver's eyes moved toward her carefully. Loyalty usually moves both directions. The observation landed gently. Several guests exchanged glances, because now the conversation had moved beyond property. It had entered the territory of recognition. Daniel leaned toward the microphone again. Look, everyone here knows our family. The line sounded defensive. People don't need to twist things around just because Jonah likes making dramatic points. Oliver smiled faintly. Jonah hasn't made any dramatic points. He gestured lightly toward me. He's mostly answered questions. Margaret nodded. Very calmly, I might add. A few guests murmured in agreement. Daniel opened his mouth to respond again, but stopped when Harold spoke from the second row. To be honest, he said, I'm more surprised that we never heard any of this before. The room shifted again. Because Harold had just spoken the quiet thought many neighbors were beginning to share. My father answered quickly. Private family matters remain private. Harold nodded slowly. Fair enough. He paused. But if Jonah owns the house and pays for it... His sentence trailed off before finishing. He didn't need to complete it. Everyone already understood the rest. Oliver Grant looked toward me again. There's one detail I'm still curious about. My mother's eyes narrowed slightly. What now? Oliver spoke gently. If Jonah has been carrying the house for 9 years, he paused, then asked the question that pushed the evening toward its second turning point. Why does Daniel still live there rent-free? The room went completely still. Daniel blinked. My father turned sharply toward Oliver. That is none of your concern. Oliver shrugged slightly. Perhaps. He glanced briefly toward Margaret. But it does relate to the financial structure we've been discussing. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. Yes, actually, it does. Daniel looked from one face to another. What's that supposed to mean? Margaret spoke calmly. If Jonah owns the property and carries the mortgage... She paused just long enough for the implication to settle. Then Daniel's housing situation becomes quite interesting. Several guests shifted in their seats again, because now the story had grown even larger. Not just a house, not just a mortgage, but a family structure where one sibling quietly supported the home, while another enjoyed it as though nothing unusual had ever happened. Daniel's voice rose slightly. Are you seriously suggesting I owe my brother rent now? Oliver didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me. Jonah? The room waited again, because now the question wasn't just about property ownership. It was about something far more personal. The moment when the favored child finally realized the rules might not apply the same way anymore. And judging by the expression slowly forming on Daniel's face, he was only beginning to understand that the quiet arrangement he had lived under for years might not exist much longer. Part 17. The silence that followed Oliver Grant's question was heavier than anything that had come before it. Why does Daniel still live there rent-free? No one in the room moved for several seconds. Even the quiet background music from the venue speakers seemed to fade into the walls, because the question did something none of the earlier ones had done. It shifted the spotlight. Until now, the story had focused on my parents and their carefully maintained version of history. The house, the mortgage, the quiet years of payments, those were structural details. But Oliver had just introduced a different dimension. Daniel, my brother. The one person in the room who had lived inside that house every single day while someone else quietly carried its financial weight. Daniel let out a short laugh. You've got to be kidding. His voice was louder now, defensive in a way that felt instinctive. This isn't some landlord situation. Several guests looked toward him. Margaret folded her hands calmly. Legally speaking, it could be interpreted that way. Daniel turned toward her. You're a solicitor. You know families don't work like that. Margaret's expression remained gentle. Families work in many different ways. She paused slightly, but ownership tends to remain consistent. My father stepped forward again. Daniel lives with us because he is part of this household. The sentence was firm, definitive. It sounded like the end of the discussion, but Oliver Grant didn't seem particularly interested in ending it. That makes sense, he said calmly. But Jonah owns the house. The sentence landed quietly. Daniel's irritation sharpened. So what? So nothing, Oliver replied. He gestured lightly toward me. I'm simply trying to understand how the arrangement functions. My mother spoke quickly. Jonah has never asked Daniel for anything. The words came out almost as reassurance, but Oliver tilted his head slightly. That's generous. Margaret nodded. Very generous. A murmur spread through the room again, because the neighbors sitting in those chairs knew Daniel. They had watched him grow up, watched him stay in the Clifton house well into adulthood, watched him park his car in the same driveway year after year. Until tonight, none of them had reason to question that arrangement. Now the structure looked different. Peter, the accountant sitting near the back, leaned slightly toward Harold. 9 years, he whispered quietly. Harold raised his eyebrows. That's significant. Daniel noticed the whispering. Oh, come on. He gestured broadly toward the room. Are we seriously going to pretend Jonah's been secretly supporting the entire house? No one answered immediately, which told him more than any spoken response could have. I spoke calmly, not the entire house. Daniel looked at me. What does that mean? The mortgage. The sentence was simple. Daniel frowned. Dad handled the rest. My father nodded quickly. Exactly. Margaret looked thoughtful. Utilities, maintenance, property taxes. My father hesitated. Handled within the household. Oliver nodded slowly. Understood. He looked at Daniel again. And you contribute to those? Daniel hesitated. A split second, but it was long enough for the room to notice. Occasionally, he said. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Occasionally. My mother spoke quickly again. Daniel has always focused on developing his career. The sentence sounded familiar, because it was. It was the same explanation I had heard for years growing up. Daniel needs more support. Jonah is more independent. Daniel frowned slightly. Mom, Oliver nodded thoughtfully. Career development can take time. Daniel straightened a little. Exactly. Then Oliver asked the next question. How long has Daniel been developing his career? The room held its breath again, because that question sounded simple, but everyone present knew Daniel's age. 32. Daniel opened his mouth. Well, my father answered first. Everyone progresses differently. Margaret nodded politely. That's certainly true. She glanced toward me again. Jonah, do you still live in the Clifton house? No. The word landed gently. Oliver looked curious. Where do you live now? Near the airport. A few guests nodded. Commercial pilots often preferred short commutes to the airfield. Margaret looked back at Daniel. So Daniel lives in the house owned by Jonah, while Jonah lives elsewhere. The sentence rearranged the entire room's understanding again. Harold leaned back slowly in his chair. Well, Peter nodded quietly beside him. That explains a few things. Daniel's voice rose slightly. What is that supposed to mean? Peter raised both hands casually. Nothing dramatic, just interesting math. Daniel looked irritated. You're all acting like I've been taking advantage of something. Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked me another question. Jonah, when you assumed the mortgage 9 years ago, did you move out then? Yes, the room shifted again, because now the timeline had become clear. 9 years ago, the financial responsibility for the house moved to me, and at exactly the same time, I had left it. Daniel blinked. Wait, he turned toward me. You moved out because of the mortgage? Not exactly. The room waited, because the answer to that question had never been discussed publicly before. My father's voice cut in quickly. Jonah wanted independence. Margaret looked toward me again. Was that the reason? I met her eyes calmly. Partly. The room felt very still again. Daniel stared at me. What's the other part? I didn't answer immediately. Because the answer wasn't a financial detail. It was something else. Something that had shaped every year since. Across the room, Oliver Grant watched quietly because he could see the story approaching a deeper layer, a layer where mortgages and property titles became secondary to something more personal. The kind of family structure that explains why one child leaves while another never has to. Daniel spoke again, slower this time. Jonah. His voice carried something new now. Unease. Why did you really leave the house? The room leaned into the silence that followed, because everyone sensed that the answer might explain far more than the mortgage ever could. Part 18, Daniel's question hung in the room with a different kind of weight than the earlier ones. Why did you really leave the house? It wasn't a financial question. It wasn't about mortgages or paperwork. It was about something the Fletcher family had spent years quietly avoiding in public conversation. The room remained still. Neighbors who had known us for decades sat motionless in their chairs. Some looked curious, others looked uncomfortable, as though they were suddenly standing too close to something private. But the truth was, the private version of the story had already slipped out into the open tonight. Oliver Grant didn't interrupt. Margaret didn't ask another legal clarification. They both simply waited. My father spoke first. Jonah left because he wanted his own life. The answer came quickly, almost automatically, the version that had always been offered. Daniel nodded toward me. Yeah, that's what you said back then. My mother's voice softened. You've always been independent. I looked at them for a moment, then at the neighbors, then at the photographs still glowing on the projector screen behind us, my parents smiling proudly beside the Clifton garden wall. A lifetime of hard work. The caption felt strangely incomplete now. Independence was part of it, I said, but not the whole reason. Daniel frowned slightly. Then what? I took a slow breath. Because once the story began moving in this direction, it would become impossible to put it back where it had been. 9 years ago, I said calmly, the bank refused to refinance the house. Several guests nodded slightly. They already knew that part now. The mortgage transferred to me. Margaret gave a small, confirming nod. Correct. Daniel crossed his arms. Right. But that still doesn't explain why you moved out. No, it doesn't. I glanced briefly at my parents, then back at him. The bank had one condition. The room leaned in again. Oliver's expression sharpened slightly with interest. Daniel raised an eyebrow. What condition? I answered quietly. That the house couldn't remain financially dependent on someone who didn't contribute. For a moment, the sentence seemed to drift through the room without landing anywhere. Then people began connecting the pieces. Margaret looked thoughtful. Ah, Oliver's lips curved slightly. That makes sense. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? I looked at him. It meant the financial structure had to change. My father spoke quickly. And it did. But Margaret asked the question my father hoped would not come. Did Daniel begin contributing to the household after the mortgage transfer? Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. My mother stepped in. Daniel was focusing on his career development. Margaret nodded politely. Yes, you mentioned that earlier. Daniel shifted his weight. Look, the situation wasn't that simple. Oliver asked gently. How so? Daniel glanced toward my parents, then back toward the audience. Jonah was making pilot money by then. The room registered the phrase immediately. Pilot money. As though that explained the entire structure. My father added quickly. Jonah insisted on helping. I didn't respond right away, because the word insisted carried its own quiet revision of history. Margaret looked toward me again. Did you insist? The room held its breath, because that question didn't just concern finances, it concerned choice. I answered simply, no. Daniel stared. Then why did you do it? I looked at him, because the bank said the house would be sold if the mortgage wasn't transferred. Several guests shifted in their seats. Now the full context had arrived. 9 years ago, the Clifton house had not simply faced financial pressure. It had faced disappearance. Oliver nodded slowly. And you stepped in. Yes. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. Okay, but that still doesn't explain why you moved out. I met his eyes, because the bank also asked another question. The room grew even quieter. Daniel's voice dropped slightly. "What question?" I answered calmly. "Why the person assuming the mortgage wasn't the one living there?" The sentence landed softly, but its meaning spread through the room almost instantly. Margaret nodded slowly again. That would be a logical concern. Oliver crossed his arms lightly. "Yes. Banks prefer financial alignment." Daniel looked confused. "Financial alignment?" I explained gently. They wanted to know why someone else was living in the house without contributing. The room fell silent again. Harold leaned back in his chair. "Well," Peter whispered something under his breath that sounded like quiet arithmetic. Daniel's expression shifted slightly. "Wait." He looked toward my parents. "You told them I was living there?" My father's jaw tightened. It was a formality. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Banks rarely treat occupancy disclosures as formalities. Daniel looked at me again. "So what did you tell them?" I answered simply, "The truth." Daniel blinked. "Which was?" I paused briefly, then said the words that quietly changed the atmosphere of the room one more time. That I didn't live there anymore. Daniel stared at me. "But you hadn't moved yet." "No." The room held its breath again. Oliver spoke softly, so the condition became clear. "Yes," I nodded. "Either the financial structure changed or the living arrangement did." Daniel's voice dropped. "And you moved out?" "Yes." He looked stunned. "You left the house so the mortgage would go through?" The sentence sounded almost disbelieving. I shrugged slightly. "It solved the problem." Margaret watched me thoughtfully. "That's a significant sacrifice." My mother spoke quickly. "Jonah wanted independence anyway." Oliver looked at her. "Perhaps." He turned back toward me, but the timing suggests something else. The room was silent again, because now everyone present understood the real structure of the past 9 years. Jonah carried the mortgage, Daniel stayed in the house, Jonah moved out, and no one outside the family had ever known the full arrangement. Daniel stared at me across the room. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I looked at him calmly, because no one asked. The answer was simple. Too simple. And somehow that made the room even quieter than before, because tonight, someone finally had. Part 19. The silence that followed my last sentence felt different from the others. Not shocked, not tense, just heavy with understanding. Because the story was no longer complicated. In fact, once everything had been said out loud, it was almost embarrassingly simple. The bank required financial alignment. I assumed the mortgage. I moved out. Daniel stayed. And no one had ever asked why. Until tonight. Harold leaned back slowly in his chair, folding his arms. "Well, that explains a lot." Several neighbors murmured quiet agreement. Peter the accountant rubbed his chin thoughtfully. 9 years of mortgage payments. He didn't finish the calculation out loud, but the number clearly existed in his head. Margaret glanced toward me again. "Jonah, may I ask one more question?" "Of course." "Did the bank ever request that Daniel contribute formally to the household?" Daniel shifted immediately. "That's ridiculous." Margaret remained calm. I asked Jonah. I nodded. "Yes." The room sharpened again. Oliver Grant watched carefully. "And did that happen?" Margaret asked. I shook my head. "No." Daniel exhaled sharply. "Because I wasn't part of the loan." Margaret acknowledged that with a small nod. "That's correct. But banks still evaluate household risk." Daniel frowned. "What risk?" Oliver answered before Margaret could. "The risk that the person carrying the mortgage is supporting additional dependents." The word dependence floated through the room like a quiet thunderclap. Daniel looked irritated. "I'm not a dependent." Peter spoke from the back row. "If someone else pays the mortgage and you live there rent-free," he shrugged slightly. "Most financial institutions would classify that arrangement carefully." Daniel looked around the room, clearly realizing the direction the conversation had taken. "You're all acting like I've been freeloading." No one responded immediately. Because the word freeloading had come from him, not from anyone else. My mother spoke again, her voice slightly tighter than before. "Daniel contributes in many ways." Margaret asked gently. "Financially?" My mother hesitated. "Within the family structure." Oliver raised one eyebrow slightly. That's a broad category. My father stepped in again. Daniel has always been focused on building his future. The sentence sounded practiced, like something repeated many times before. Harold muttered quietly to Peter. At 32, Peter coughed softly, hiding a small smile. Daniel noticed. You think this is funny? Harold shook his head. Not funny. Just clearer than it used to be. The room shifted again, because people were no longer guessing about the Fletcher family dynamic. They were watching it in real time. Margaret turned back toward me. Jonah, one more point of curiosity. Did Daniel know about the mortgage structure? Daniel answered immediately. Of course I did. Margaret looked at him calmly. From the beginning, Daniel hesitated, a moment too long. My mother spoke quickly. The family understood the situation. Oliver tilted his head slightly. That's not the same question. He looked toward Daniel. Did you know Jonah would be responsible for the mortgage alone? Daniel ran a hand through his hair. I knew he was helping. Helping. The same word my father had used earlier. The same word that sounded smaller every time it was repeated tonight. I spoke quietly. You knew the bank transferred the loan. Daniel avoided my eyes. Yeah. But what? He sighed. I thought it was temporary. Margaret looked interested. Temporary? Daniel nodded. Until things stabilized. Oliver glanced at my father. Was that the plan? My father's voice came carefully now. That was the expectation. Margaret raised her eyebrows slightly, but the title remained in Jonah's name. Yes, 9 years. The number sat heavily in the air again, because temporary arrangements rarely lasted nearly a decade. Daniel looked frustrated now. Look, it wasn't like anyone was hiding anything. Harold spoke softly. You did introduce him as the maid tonight. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but stopped, because there was no easy response to that. My mother stepped forward again. It was a joke. The room didn't react this time. Not with laughter, not with agreement, just silence. Oliver Grant looked around the room thoughtfully. Something interesting happens in situations like this. Several guests glanced toward him. He continued calmly. People often believe a story for years because it sounds reasonable. My father looked at him stiffly. Our family story is reasonable, Oliver nodded. It was. He paused until the details arrived. Margaret smiled faintly. Documentation has that effect. Daniel shook his head. You're all acting like we manipulated something. No one answered immediately, because that word, manipulated, was far more serious than anything anyone else had said. Peter spoke quietly from the back. Maybe not manipulated. He glanced toward me, but definitely misunderstood. The room absorbed that distinction. Misunderstood. It sounded gentler, but it carried the same outcome. For nearly a decade, the Fletcher family image had rested on a version of events that wasn't fully accurate. And now the real structure had appeared in front of witnesses. Daniel turned toward me again. His voice was lower now. Why didn't you ever correct people? I met his gaze. Correct them about what? About the house, about the mortgage, about all of this. I shrugged slightly, because it didn't matter. The answer confused him. What do you mean it didn't matter? I gestured lightly around the room. Everyone believed the version they preferred. Oliver nodded slowly. People usually do. Margaret added thoughtfully. Until evidence arrives. Daniel looked between us, struggling with something he hadn't considered before. You mean you just let us take credit for it? The room waited, because now the question had shifted again. Not about money, not about the house, but about silence. The kind of silence that allows one version of a story to grow larger while another quietly disappears. I answered simply, I didn't need credit. Daniel frowned. Then why carry the mortgage? The answer came without hesitation. Because the house needed someone who could. The sentence landed gently, but it left the entire room thinking about something none of them had considered when the evening began. What kind of person quietly carries someone else's foundation and never mentions it for nearly a decade? Oliver Grant watched me carefully now, because that question had just become far more important than the house itself. Part 20. The room had grown so quiet that the faint hum of the projector sounded almost loud. Everyone was still thinking about the same question Oliver Grant had just allowed to form in the air. What kind of person quietly carries someone else's foundation and never mentions it? For 9 years, without argument, without correction, without claiming credit. It was the kind of detail that rearranged how people understood a story. Not loudly, but permanently. Daniel leaned forward slightly toward the microphone, his expression no longer irritated so much as unsettled. "You're making it sound like some kind of sacrifice." I shrugged. It wasn't. Several guests exchanged glances. Because the answer sounded almost too simple, Oliver spoke calmly. Most people would consider 9 years of mortgage payments a meaningful commitment. Margaret nodded beside him, particularly when the person making those payments no longer lives in the property. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "You could have told people." I looked at him. "Why?" The question landed with quiet weight. Daniel blinked. "What do you mean, why?" I gestured lightly around the room. Would it have changed anything? No one answered immediately, because the question forced everyone present to imagine the last 9 years with the truth known publicly. The same holidays, the same dinners, the same neighborhood conversations, except with one small difference. Everyone would know whose name sat on the mortgage. Harold leaned back slowly. "Honestly?" He spoke thoughtfully. "Yeah, it probably would have changed a few conversations." Peter nodded. "Definitely a few assumptions." My father cleared his throat again. "Our family never asked Jonah to make himself responsible for the house." The sentence sounded defensive, but Oliver tilted his head slightly. "Did anyone ask him not to?" My father paused. My mother spoke carefully. "We trusted Jonah's generosity." Margaret raised an eyebrow gently. "Trust usually works best when it's mutual." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "You're all twisting this around." Oliver smiled faintly. "No one's twisting anything." He gestured toward the room. "We're simply listening." The neighbors remained quiet, but the atmosphere had clearly shifted again. At the beginning of the evening, they had been an audience for a retirement celebration. Now they had become witnesses to something far more revealing. Not dramatic, just clarifying. Daniel turned toward me again. "Okay." His voice was slower now. "Let's say everything you're saying is true." "It is." He ignored that. "Why keep paying the mortgage all this time?" I answered calmly. "Because the agreement never changed." Margaret looked curious. "Agreement?" My father stiffened slightly. "Jonah?" But the word had already landed in the room. Oliver spoke softly. "What agreement?" Daniel frowned. "What are you talking about?" I looked at him. 9 years ago, when the bank transferred the mortgage, I paused briefly. "Your situation was supposed to change." Daniel stared. "My situation?" Margaret leaned forward slightly in her chair. "What kind of change?" I answered simply, "Employment." Daniel blinked. "Wait." My mother stepped forward quickly. "Jonah, this really isn't." But the room was already listening. Daniel looked confused. "What does my job have to do with the mortgage?" Oliver answered calmly. "Income stability often matters in financial arrangements." Daniel looked back at me. "You're saying the bank cared whether I had a job?" I nodded. "Yes." His face tightened slightly. "That's ridiculous." Margaret shook her head gently. "Not really. Household financial structures often depend on all adults contributing." Daniel looked toward my parents. "You told the bank I was unemployed?" My father answered quickly. "It was temporary." Oliver's voice remained calm. 9 years is a long temporary period. A few quiet chuckles moved through the room again. Daniel turned back toward me. "So the agreement was what?" I answered evenly. "That the situation would stabilize." He frowned. "It did stabilize." "Did it?" The question hung quietly in the air, because everyone present knew what stabilize meant in financial terms: employment, income, contribution. Daniel's voice rose slightly. "I've been working." Peter the accountant spoke gently from the back. "How long at the current job?" Daniel hesitated. "A year." Peter nodded thoughtfully. "Before that?" Daniel shifted. "Consulting." Oliver raised an eyebrow. "Independent consulting?" Daniel nodded. Margaret glanced toward me again. Jonah, during those 9 years, did Daniel ever formally contribute toward the mortgage? The room went still again. Because the answer to that question would complete the financial picture everyone had been slowly assembling all evening. I answered calmly, no. Daniel stared at me. You never asked. That part was true. I never did. Margaret folded her hands thoughtfully. So the mortgage was entirely Jonah's responsibility. Yes, Oliver added quietly, while Daniel continued living in the house. Yes, the room absorbed the structure one more time. 9 years, one mortgage holder, one resident, two completely different financial roles. Daniel looked around the room, suddenly aware of how the situation now appeared to everyone watching. This isn't fair. Harold raised an eyebrow. Fair? Daniel gestured toward me. He makes pilot money. Peter shrugged, and spends it on a mortgage for a house he doesn't live in. Daniel opened his mouth again, but stopped, because for the first time that evening, he seemed to realize the story sounded different when other people repeated it out loud. My mother spoke again, her voice quieter now. Jonah has always been generous. Oliver nodded slightly. Yes. He looked toward me again, but generosity often has limits. The room went silent once more, because everyone understood what that sentence suggested. 9 years of quiet responsibility. 9 years of silence. 9 years of allowing someone else to enjoy the benefits. At some point, most people would reconsider the arrangement. Daniel looked at me again. His voice had lost its earlier confidence. You're not saying... He stopped, but the thought had already formed in his mind. I didn't answer immediately because the real question had finally arrived. Not about the past, about the future. And judging by the way my parents were watching me now, they had just realized the same thing at exactly the same moment. Part 21. Daniel didn't finish his sentence, but he didn't need to. The thought had already taken shape in the room. You're not saying... Everyone understood what he had meant. Because once the entire financial structure had been laid out piece by piece, only one question remained. What happens next? For 9 years, the arrangement had been stable, even if no one outside the family had understood it. I carried the mortgage. Daniel lived in the house. My parents maintained the story that the Clifton home represented their success. But tonight, something had changed. Not the documents, not the payments, just the audience. Now dozens of people knew the truth, and that made the future feel uncertain. My mother spoke first, her voice carefully calm. Jonah, we can discuss family matters privately later. The sentence sounded polite, reasonable, but it carried an unmistakable urgency because she understood what the rest of the room was beginning to wonder. If the mortgage was nearly complete, then ownership would soon be absolute. Oliver Grant watched the moment quietly and said nothing. Margaret, however, asked the question everyone else was thinking. Jonah, when is the mortgage scheduled to finish? My father exhaled slowly. Margaret. But the solicitor's attention remained on me. Soon, I said. How soon? A few more payments. A murmur spread softly across the room. Because people who understood mortgages also understood what that meant. Years of obligation narrowing down to months. Peter the accountant leaned slightly forward in his chair. That's a significant milestone. Oliver nodded. Yes, it usually prompts certain decisions. Daniel looked between them. What decisions? Neither man answered. Instead, they looked at me. Daniel followed their gaze. His voice came out slower now. Jonah, what are you planning to do? The room held its breath again, because the question had finally arrived in its simplest form. Not what had happened, not who paid what, but what comes next. I thought about the Clifton house for a moment. The garden wall from the slideshow photos, the kitchen table where we had eaten dinner growing up, the living room where my parents hosted holiday parties, the same house where I had lived until the day the mortgage papers moved into my name. Then I answered calmly, I haven't decided yet. Daniel stared. What do you mean you haven't decided? Oliver's voice remained calm. That's usually how ownership works. The owner decides. My father stepped forward again. The house has always belonged to this family. Margaret nodded politely. And legally, Jonah is the family member who owns it. The distinction was subtle, but the room understood it perfectly. Daniel looked frustrated again. You're not seriously thinking about selling it? I didn't answer immediately, because the question itself revealed something interesting. For the first time that evening, Daniel sounded uncertain about something he had always assumed was permanent. The Clifton house. His home. The place he had lived without question for more than 3 decades. Oliver spoke quietly. That's one possibility. My mother's voice sharpened slightly. Jonah would never do that. I glanced toward her. Why not? The room went still again, because the question had been asked gently, but it carried real weight. My mother blinked. Because this is your home too. I shook my head slightly. It used to be. The sentence landed softly, but its meaning moved through the room like a quiet shift in gravity. Daniel stared. You grew up there? Yes. But I don't live there. Oliver nodded thoughtfully. And haven't for 9 years. Margaret added quietly. The owner lives elsewhere. Harold leaned back again. That does change the emotional math. Daniel ran both hands through his hair. You're seriously considering this? I looked at him. Considering what? Selling. The word hung between us. A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats because now the conversation had moved from historical curiosity into something very real. The future of the house everyone in the neighborhood knew. My father spoke again, his voice tight. The house is not for sale. Oliver answered calmly. That decision belongs to Jonah. My mother looked at me again. You wouldn't do that to us. The sentence sounded softer than anything she had said all evening. Not angry, almost pleading. And for the first time tonight, the room seemed unsure how the story might end. Because until now, the facts had only explained the past. Now they were beginning to shape the future. Daniel stepped closer to the microphone. You're not actually going to kick us out. I met his eyes calmly. I haven't said that, but you're thinking about it. The room went silent again, because the possibility had finally been spoken out loud. 9 years of quiet responsibility, 9 years of silent support, and now the moment when the person carrying that weight might choose something different. Oliver Grant watched me carefully, not with judgment, with curiosity, because moments like this revealed something deeper than financial arrangements. They revealed character. Margaret asked gently, Jonah, have you ever told your parents what you wanted to do with the house once the mortgage ended? I shook my head. No. My father frowned. Why not? I answered simply. Because no one ever asked. The sentence echoed faintly through the microphone speakers. And once again, the room fell into silence. Because tonight, people were finally asking. Part 22. The room remained suspended in a quiet tension that no one seemed eager to break. For most of the evening, the conversation had been about the past. What had happened 9 years ago, how the mortgage moved, who paid what, who stayed in the house. But now the conversation had crossed into a more uncomfortable territory. The future. And futures are harder to predict than paperwork. Daniel stood near the microphone, staring at me as if trying to read a decision that I hadn't spoken yet. You're seriously thinking about selling the house. It wasn't quite a question anymore, more like a realization forming out loud. I didn't answer immediately, not because I was avoiding the question, but because the truth was simpler than everyone expected. I hadn't thought about it very much. For 9 years, the arrangement had simply existed. The mortgage was there. The payments were there. The house remained where it had always been. Life moved forward. My job kept me traveling between cities and airports. My parents continued hosting gatherings in the Clifton house. Daniel continued living there. Nothing had forced a change until tonight. Oliver Grant's voice arrived quietly from across the room. Ownership creates choices. Several guests nodded slowly, because that was the real shift everyone had begun to notice. Not the money, not the mortgage, the choices. My mother looked at me again, her expression no longer confident in the way it had been at the beginning of the evening. Jonah, that house has been our home for 20 years. I nodded. I know. Daniel stepped closer. You can't just decide to sell it. Oliver spoke calmly. Actually, he can. The sentence was delivered without any dramatic emphasis, just a simple observation of legal reality. Margaret nodded slightly. Property law tends to be quite clear. Daniel turned toward them. Frustrated. You two are enjoying this way too much. Oliver smiled faintly, not enjoying, just observing. Harold spoke from the second row. To be fair, none of us knew about any of this before tonight. Peter added quietly, that's the surprising part, because that detail had become obvious to everyone present. For years, the Fletcher family had projected a certain image: stability, success, control. But now the room understood that image rested quietly on the shoulders of the one person who had never spoken about it. My father stepped forward again. Jonah has always understood what the house means to this family. His voice carried the authority he had used for decades. But something about it felt different tonight, less certain. Because authority works best when the underlying structure supports it. And tonight that structure had shifted. Margaret looked toward me again. Jonah, have you ever actually considered selling it? The question landed gently. I thought about it for a moment. Not seriously. The room absorbed that answer. Daniel exhaled quietly, but the word arrived before I had fully decided to say it. And suddenly, every person in the room leaned forward just a little. But, Daniel asked carefully. I looked at him. Tonight is the first time anyone has asked what I want to do with it. The sentence changed the atmosphere again, because it revealed something subtle but important. For 9 years, decisions about the Clifton house had been assumed, never discussed. My mother spoke quietly. We assumed you wanted the house to stay in the family. I nodded slightly. You assumed a lot of things. The words were not harsh, just accurate. Oliver folded his arms lightly. Assumptions tend to last until someone checks them. Daniel looked uneasy again. So what do you want? The room waited. Neighbors, friends, a solicitor, the CEO who had recognized me earlier. Everyone understood that this was the real question of the evening, not about the past, about intention. I answered honestly. I don't know yet. Daniel blinked. You don't know? No. Margaret smiled faintly. That's a perfectly reasonable position. Oliver nodded. Especially when a major asset becomes fully owned. My father looked frustrated. This is absurd. We're talking about a family home, not a corporate acquisition. Oliver's tone remained calm. The law treats both the same way. Daniel ran a hand across his face. So what happens now? Margaret answered thoughtfully. Now Jonah finishes paying the mortgage. And then? Daniel asked. She shrugged slightly. Then Jonah decides what he wants. The room absorbed the simplicity of that statement. 9 years of financial responsibility had quietly led to this exact moment. A single person holding the final choice. My mother's voice softened again. Jonah, I looked at her. You know, we always believed the house would stay with the family. The sentence was careful, but it carried something else beneath it. Expectation. Daniel nodded. Yeah. You wouldn't just take that away from us. The room remained quiet again, because that phrasing, take it away, implied something interesting. Ownership had existed for 9 years, but the emotional understanding of it had only just arrived tonight. Oliver spoke quietly. No one takes something away that they already own. The sentence settled into the room like a final adjustment to the story everyone thought they knew. Daniel stared at the floor for a moment, then looked back at me. You're really going to think about this? Not a question, a statement. I nodded. Yes. And that single word seemed to land harder than anything else spoken all evening, because for the first time since the mortgage transferred 9 years ago, the future of the Fletcher family home had become uncertain. Part 23. The uncertainty lingered in the room like the final note of a song that no one was quite ready to let fade. For most of the evening, the Clifton house had been treated like an unshakable constant. It appeared in every photo of the slideshow. It was referenced in nearly every story my father told about his career, his sacrifices, the life he believed he had built. But now the audience understood something different. The house was not a monument, it was an asset. And assets, once fully owned, come with choices. Daniel leaned against the edge of the projector table, quieter than he had been all night. His earlier confidence had softened into something closer to calculation. So you're really going to think about selling it? The sentence came out slowly, as though he were testing the words for the first time. I didn't rush to answer. Not because I wanted to make the moment dramatic, but because the truth was something I was only beginning to consider myself. 9 years earlier, my decision had been simple. Save the house. That was the entire objective. At the time, there hadn't been a bigger plan attached to it. The bank had made the situation clear. Either someone capable assumed the mortgage, or the Clifton property would be listed and sold. I had stepped in because I could. That had been the beginning and the end of the logic. But 9 years later, the mortgage was almost gone, which meant the reason for the arrangement was about to disappear with it. Oliver Grant broke the silence with the same calm tone he had used throughout the evening. Jonah doesn't need to decide tonight. Margaret nodded. In fact, it would be wiser if he didn't. My father looked irritated. Why not? Margaret gestured lightly toward the room. Because important decisions tend to benefit from distance. Oliver added quietly, and from clarity. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if trying to push away the growing discomfort. Clarity about what? Oliver's answer was simple. About what Jonah actually wants. The room absorbed that phrase carefully. Because until tonight, the idea of what Jonah wanted had never been part of the Fletcher family conversation. My mother spoke gently. We always believed we knew what he wanted. I looked at her. Yes, you did. The sentence wasn't confrontational, but it carried the quiet truth that assumptions had shaped most of the past decade. Harold leaned toward Peter again. Funny thing about assumptions, he murmured. Peter nodded. They work until the numbers show up. Daniel ran his hands through his hair again. Look, maybe we're making this bigger than it is. His voice sounded less defensive now, more cautious. It's just a house. Several people in the room exchanged glances. Because earlier in the evening, Daniel had spoken about the house as though it were untouchable. Now he sounded as though he were trying to reduce its importance. Oliver noticed the shift too. Yes, he said thoughtfully. It is just a house. Daniel nodded quickly. Exactly, Oliver continued, but houses also represent security, stability, location. He glanced toward Daniel, especially for the people living in them. Daniel didn't respond. My father stepped forward again. Jonah has never suggested changing the living arrangements. Margaret looked at me. Have you? No. My father spread his hands slightly as though the matter were now settled. You see. But Margaret tilted her head thoughtfully. That doesn't mean the possibility hasn't existed. Daniel's eyes moved toward me again, and suddenly the room could see something new in his expression. Not irritation, not anger, concern, because the structure he had relied on for years suddenly looked less permanent. My mother spoke again, her voice quieter now. Jonah, we've always been proud of you. The sentence seemed to arrive from a completely different emotional direction than anything earlier in the evening. Perhaps she realized it too because she continued more carefully. You've done well for yourself. I nodded slightly. Thank you. Daniel watched the exchange uneasily. But the conversation had shifted into unfamiliar territory. Acknowledgement, recognition, things that had been strangely absent from the family narrative earlier. Oliver noticed it as well. Respect usually arrives late in stories like this. My father frowned slightly. What stories? Oliver looked around the room, the kind where someone quietly carries responsibility while others assume the credit. The sentence landed without accusation, just observation. Margaret added gently. And eventually the facts surface. The room sat with that thought for a moment. Then Daniel asked the question that had been quietly forming in his mind since the beginning of the evening. Jonah. I looked at him. Did you ever resent it? The room went completely still again. Because this was the first question of the night that had nothing to do with money, documents, or property titles. It was personal. Honest. I considered the question carefully. 9 years is a long time. Long enough for resentment to grow if it's going to. But resentment had never been the reason I stayed quiet. I answered simply, no. Daniel looked surprised. No? He frowned. Then why never say anything? The answer came as calmly as everything else I had said tonight. Because it didn't matter who received the credit. The room absorbed the sentence slowly. Oliver Grant watched me with quiet interest. Margaret smiled faintly. Daniel looked thoughtful. Because for the first time all evening, he seemed to realize something that had never crossed his mind before. Jonah hadn't stayed silent because he was weak. He had stayed silent because he simply didn't need the recognition. And that realization changed the way everyone in the room saw the story one last time. But Daniel still had one more question, one that now mattered more than any of the others. If credit never mattered. He paused slightly. Then why are you speaking now? Part 24, Daniel's question lingered in the quiet room with a different kind of gravity. If credit never mattered, then why are you speaking now? It was the most honest question anyone had asked all evening. Not defensive, not accusatory, just confused. And the truth was, the answer had already been revealed earlier in the night, though no one had fully understood it at the time. I looked at Daniel for a moment, then at my parents, then at the neighbors who had watched the entire story unfold piece by piece. I'm not speaking now, I said calmly. Daniel frowned. What? I shook my head slightly. I still haven't said very much. A few people in the room smiled faintly. Because it was true. Throughout the entire evening, I had mostly answered questions. The story had revealed itself. Oliver Grant nodded slowly. Facts tend to do that. Daniel leaned forward slightly, but if you didn't care about credit, he hesitated. Why let everyone believe the wrong thing for so long? I thought about that question carefully, because it deserved an honest answer. For a long time, I said, it didn't matter what people believed. The room listened. My parents maintained their version of the story. The house stayed. Daniel stayed. Life continued. No one was harmed by the misunderstanding. Daniel looked uncertain. But tonight, I glanced briefly at my mother, then back at him. Tonight, someone tried to turn the story into something else. The memory of that moment returned to the room immediately. The introduction. The word Maid. The laughter that had followed. Daniel looked down for a moment. My mother's hands tightened around her glass. I continued calmly. That changed things. Oliver Grant spoke quietly from across the room. Because respect matters. I nodded once. Yes, Margaret added thoughtfully. There's a difference between letting people misunderstand a success and allowing them to misunderstand your role entirely. The room absorbed the distinction. Daniel lifted his head again. So the line was the Maid comment. I didn't answer right away, but my silence said enough. My father exhaled slowly, the tension finally leaving his shoulders in a way that hadn't happened all evening. Perhaps we pushed too far tonight. The sentence sounded reluctant, but genuine. My mother looked at me again, and this time there was no performance left in her expression, just something closer to realization. Jonah, she paused. We never meant to diminish you. The words hung carefully in the air. They weren't dramatic, but they were closer to an acknowledgement than anything that had been said earlier. Daniel nodded slightly. Yeah, that part wasn't fair. The room remained quiet again, not tense, just reflective. Because the story that had unfolded tonight wasn't really about property law or mortgages anymore. It was about recognition. Oliver Grant stepped away from the dessert table and walked a few steps closer to the group near the microphone. For what it's worth, he said calmly, this has been one of the more educational retirement parties I've attended. A few quiet laughs moved through the room. Margaret smiled. Documentation can be very persuasive. Oliver looked at me again. Your approach tonight was impressive. I raised an eyebrow slightly. My approach? He nodded. You didn't argue. You didn't accuse. You simply let the facts appear. That's usually the strongest position in any negotiation. Daniel glanced toward me again. You planned this? I shook my head. No, Oliver chuckled softly. That's the interesting part. The room looked toward him, because the person who tries to control the story often assumes the quiet one has no strategy. He gestured lightly toward me, but sometimes the quiet person is simply waiting for the right moment. Margaret nodded, and the right witnesses. Several neighbors smiled knowingly. Harold leaned toward Peter. Didn't expect a retirement party to turn into a master class. Peter grinned. Worth attending after all. The tension in the room finally softened, not because the facts had changed, but because everyone now understood them. My father looked around at the guests who had spent decades hearing one version of his life story. Then back at me. Perhaps the slideshow needs an update. The comment carried a hint of humor, but also something else. Acceptance. Daniel looked toward the screen where the photo of the Clifton house still glowed. Martin and Elaine's dream home. He shook his head slightly. Guess the caption was missing a line. Oliver raised his glass to accurate captions. A few people lifted their drinks with quiet smiles. I looked once more at the photograph of the house, the place that had held so many stories, some true, some incomplete. But now the entire room understood the full version. Not because I had demanded recognition, but because the facts had finally been given space to speak. And once facts appear in the open, they rarely need anyone to defend them.